Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Break the Rules. I'm Lev Polyakov, your humble host, and today we have Michael J. Hout, who is a New Englander. He is a former Democrat. He is a columnist for TownHall and editor of Liberty Affair. And we have Crusader Pepe, which is definitely the most appropriate of all combinations to have Michael here with, one of the original Crusaders of the what was it, the Dark Ages, the Knights Templar, right? You are an official member of the Knights Templar. Is that right, Crusader Pepe?
That's exactly right.
And that means that you reject Jesus Christ, you spit on the crucifix, and instead you honor John the Baptist and consider there to have been the transmission from John the Baptist to Simon Magus, where Jesus was actually a false Messiah. Can you confirm that for the audience?
I'm actually just a Protestant, so.
Same thing. Anyway, we are going to be talking about the future of the conservative movement here in the United States, whether these young upstarts that are appealing to all of these dopamine-deprived people terminally online are going to be the victors, or whether eventually as people grow up, they start having a little bit more common sense, they start turning into their father, and I don't know which one is going to win out, because judging by the way that a lot of people are going psychologically speaking, it does seem that people have this more prolonged sense of adolescence, but that's just what I think. I could be wrong. But to start this conversation off, why don't we go to Michael? And by the way, both of these guys here, for the very first time, I don't know what to expect. I'm very excited, but let's go to Michael. Tell us just in general what exactly you've been seeing from the conservatives in the last couple of weeks, this kind of post-Charlie Kirk split that's been occurring even more so than it has been before. So guide us through that, and then we're going to go to the Good Crusader. And don't forget, everybody, to smash that subscribe button, smash that like button, and click the bell. All of that is very important. Anyway, Michael, you got the floor.
Thanks, Lev. So I wrote a piece for TownHall a few weeks ago. And when I wrote that piece, I called it, actually, there was a first piece called The Unmooring of the American Right. I didn't call it anyone by name. I kind of stuck to ideas. My readers hated that, called me out on that, compared me to Immanuel Kant. They said I don't use any examples, which I took to heart, and wrote a follow-up piece that was called Calling Out the Cancer on the Right, or Within the Right. And in that piece, I talked about, Fuentes, Groyper movement, but I also talked about Candace Owens, kind of the conspiratorial right, alluded to Tucker there. And then I was talking also about this odd, lesser-known group of MAGA communists like Jackson Hinkle. That piece ended up catching the eye of Dana Loesch, who had me on her show the same day the Fuentes interview dropped. So I was talking about that piece, and then the Fuentes Tucker interview dropped, and then it's seemingly, the floor dropped beneath us, and everything went absolutely wild on X. And so it seems to be at the core. There's, a fight over, foreign policy, over the difficulties that Gen Zers are having financially and otherwise, and also just debate about what's going to happen after Trump, with JD Vance, which tact is Vance going to take, and is Vance who succeeds Trump, and so it's been a really interesting couple of weeks on X, and I'm not sure how much of that is reflected in reality, or if it's just kind of we're banging heads on X. But that's about what's been going on from my perspective.
Well, to bring this to Crusader Pepe, what I'm curious about is whether you see there being this bifurcation of the online world and offline world as much today, Or are you seeing a lot of things that are going on X transferring over, maybe not in terms of the boomers, but in terms of, later millennial and then Gen Z and then Gen A, eventually that is going to become their culture. So even though right now, Michael can see all of these apparently disturbing things going on, with the various conspiracies, some of them true, some of them fake, many of them probably paid for by foreign intelligence. How much do you think this is going to be very effective on these next generations as opposed to the boomers right now? You think it's pretty much equal? It's going to be more? Let us know what you think.
Yeah, so I think fundamentally there's a major change that is actually happening, and the reason why it probably doesn't seem as legitimate in the real world is there's social pressure and punishment for opposing narratives that have been basically the accepted mainstream view of things over the past 40, 50, 75 years. And so I think when you have some of these more edgy topics come up, people are generally not going to voice them in person, but they will online because they have a layer of protection, I guess, from social stigma. But I think the reality is people under 40 are shifting dramatically to both to the left and the right. And one of the reasons I wanted to talk to Michael a little bit more is we've gone back and forth a little bit on this, and I feel like he was, relatively charitable and interested in hearing my perspective. And so what I think is the major problem right now is people that are trying to gatekeep and stop these changes, or it feels like that. People like Dana is a good example of them. I've ratioed her a few times for the past couple weeks. And my main issue with them is they're treating everyone they disagree with as kind of this single caricature. They treat everyone on what we'll call it the new right as Nick Fuentes disciples or whatever it might be.
The woke right.
And yes, the woke right, the scary woke right, where we all summon demons from Saint Michael. And I think the people that are kind of in this more moderate, and I won't say Michael because I don't know, but the people that seem to be in the more quote unquote moderate camp, the James Lindsays, the Dave Rubins of the world that are, we'll call it classical liberals, return to the 90s type Republicans. I don't think they really actually have a full grasp on the different factions in the new right. So there's definitely the Candace Fuentes types, but there's a whole other sphere of Christians that are really just returning to the policies of someone like Pat Buchanan, pre-Buckley, Purge type conservatives. And so I think where there's a lot of friction is people like Dinesh D'Souza, Dana Lash. They're just arguing against like Hitler Groyper 1529 on Twitter, and then they're applying that to everyone they disagree with ideologically or on a policy level. And so I think there's just either an intentional misunderstanding going on there, or they just have political enemies that they want to take out of the picture. And I think that's why so many people on the new right are so frustrated.
And Honkler Bear over here in the comments says, "Oh, that's me." And by the way, if you guys have anything you want to ask these wonderful panelists, be sure to sneed those super chats. But anyway, Michael, do you think that Crusader Pepe is right on this, or do you see there being something that, regardless of the nuance of their views, something that a lot of these people do have in common?
Yeah, so both. I mean, I think okay, new right. So that's a good term to use. So for calling it the new right, I think it's definitely somewhat balkanized, right? There's definitely a perspective that Nick Fuentes shares in particular that I have a hard time with. I don't have a hard time per se with the America First concept, right? Although it certainly gets a little complicated when you start going down that path. But I think that I've interacted with many people, not all of them with the frog in their profile, Pepe the Frog in their profile, but some. And I've had people talk to me in all seriousness about, here's why the Holocaust didn't happen, all these things. But then on the other hand, I've had people that are acolytes or whatever you want to call it, Fuentes, who do not believe that stuff. And so I think there are gradations to it, and it's not, it's not perfectly, it's not like a RPG template, right, from a video game, like, okay, believe all these things. It's definitely somewhat individualized, but there's also commonalities, right? Like I definitely think for the most part, the sentiment is against Israel among the new right? And there's other components to that, but I think so. Yeah, I mean, I think there's some of both there, but definitely I see it as more nuanced because I'm actually talking and engaging with people in DMs and on X. Yeah,
I have a question for both of you. Go on, Crusader Pepe.
Yeah. So, and I think the core of the issue, when it comes down to it, is people that I would say are acting somewhat like gatekeepers. They treat it as though, I think Nick Fuentes is right about some of the problems in this country, just like probably leftists are right about some of the problems in this country. Maybe we have different solutions, but I think what I'm seeing is they're treating, he'll bring up a problem with young men, and the establishment conservatives seem to be going, well, Nick said it, so therefore it's bad. And it's evolving into this, what feels like leftist tactics and operating from a leftist frame and morality to cancel conservatives. So Mike Pence just put out an article about how there's no room for opposing Israel in the conservative movement. And I think it's perfectly rational to be a conservative, to be right wing and say, I don't want to send billions to Israel. I don't want to be involved with them. I'm more isolationist in nature. I think that's completely in line with the founding of the country. George Washington in his farewell address made it very clear there's some serious issues with getting too entangled in foreign engagements.
Yeah, well, then the Barbary Pirates thing happened if we look back.
Well, and the thing is, when I hear that language, there's no room for this. I'm concerned, bro, about all of these quote unquote new policies that really aren't that new to the American right. It feels like the establishment's trying to wrestle control back from MAGA and the Trump movement. And they're doing this because they know that they're on the clock. And if they don't make a serious pushback against this now, the Trump coalition is going to be the victorious coalition. J.D. Vance will be the successor. And it feels like the entire goal of them is I don't think they really care about some of these issues as much as they want to maintain their prestige, power, and position and push out their former political enemies like Vance. Vance has never been loved by the kind of the typical Republican player or the typical Republican Party official. And so that's what I'm seeing on my side. What do you think about that, Michael?
Yeah, so I definitely hear you on the gatekeeping, right? And to be honest with you, to the extent that I'm gatekeeping, I'm trying to gatekeep from things that I think are damaging to the conservative movement. I don't think necessarily that everyone that identifies as a Groyper or as a member of the new right is damaging to the conservative movement or that they don't have any valid concerns to raise. I don't think that Israel is a topic we can never discuss. I do think Israel is important, which we can discuss if you'd like why I think that. But I think that what I'm trying to gatekeep against are, things like Stalin was great, Hitler was great, the Holocaust never happened. I'm talking to you from Warsaw, Poland right now in a building that was built just after World War II because 95+% of the city was destroyed by the Nazis, razed to the ground after the Warsaw Uprising and before. And so, my wife's Polish, my kids are Polish American, and I find both fascism and communism, really all totalitarianism, to be inherently un-American, un-Polish, right? Or anti-American, anti-Polish. And so those are the things I'm fighting against. It's like Lev mentioned at the beginning, I'm a former Democrat. I was the national chartering director for College Democrats, and I was very active. I worked on the Clinton campaign for a bit, and I left the party because I felt like it was going too far to the left for what I was comfortable with. And so what I'm worried now is after Trump, there's going to be a push by Fuentes and his supporters to move far to the right. And I'm happy to have conversations about foreign policy, about the difficulties that young people are having with affording a home, with paying off student loan, all these different things, right? Like we can have all these conversations, but the surface level stuff really concerns me, because to some people, Stalin was great might just be a joke, like an internet meme or something. But to me, it's like, we're getting to the point now. It's like, this is like multiple generations ago, like people are starting to forget about these things, maybe to some extent. And so I do worry about, the rise of communism or the rise of fascism. And I don't mean like what Democrats call fascism, which is just Trump. Like I am a Trump supporter, right? So it's not like I'm some neocon. Like I do read National Review and stuff. Like, so I am a little bit, but like I support Trump. I voted for Trump. So my concern is what lies to the right of Trump, essentially.
I have a question for both of you guys. When it comes to audience capture, this has been a really, really big concern for myself on the...
I think we lost Lev.
Yeah, I was going to say, was that me, or I think it was him? Okay, we'll wait.
Here we go. My apologies. I don't know what exactly happened there. That was a little bit weird. But anyway, we are back over here. And here we go. Let me just reset these guys. Let's see, Crusader Pepe. Here you are. Here, I don't know why this Lev is over here. I don't know what he's doing here. If I remove myself from the studio, will that be okay? That is fine. Anyway, we are back. So as I was saying, when it comes to audience capture, a really big concern for me has been the fact that I don't really think that the generations of people today could ever be considered to be, well, these people are a very patient generation. They're going to consider both sides of any kind of issue. They're going to research various things. I think both of you guys could agree that is not the case, right? That a lot of people, their dopamine zapped, they need to have stimulation constantly. And if that's the new base of people, for people like Nick Fuentes, for instance, to generate revenue from and to grow from, then like forget even about Nick Fuentes. If we see people like Fuentes as being nothing more than the slave to whatever is considered to be the most popular thing among his audience, at that point, any kind of nuance goes out the window. And then comes the question of, well, how much can we rely on the trajectory that the new right is going into right now to be one that, manages to reach, an ankle length of where the founding fathers were intellectually speaking, since so many of the quote-unquote influencers have ceased to become people. Now they are merely just slaves of the algorithm. And what exactly do we do about that, regardless of our intentions?
Yeah, that's a good point. One thing I would say kind of around this mimetic energy is that, while some of these memes are edgy and they're a little bit more taboo, I don't see them as exponentially different than something like South Park or Family Guy from 10, 15 years ago. They're just topically more right-wing or more libertarian or whatever it might be. And I think you bring a valid point. I'm not a huge Fuentes fan. I think he's right about certain things and he's wrong about a lot. And I certainly don't love all of his followers either. But, I think that's why it's very critical, though, for reasonable people. And Michael and I would probably disagree on the definition of a reasonable person on the right. But I think it's important that we also make sure that reasonable people are in the driver's seat. And by that, I mean people who are grounded in a genuine Christian faith, that have, a background in the country, as an Anglo-Protestant nation, which America is, that they're building upon the nation's heritage. Fuentes, for for all that he does, in a lot of ways, he is decidedly not American, whether that's his Catholicism, some of his viewpoints on certain issues. He's not necessarily, I would say, basing his political trajectory and beliefs solely on American values or even Anglo values, if we go back even further. And so, I agree that the people who are, getting wrapped up in these, a lot of times they're just having fun with memes. And I think the establishment conservatives take some of it a little too seriously. I don't think it's risk-free, though. I think any future right-wing movement has to be steeped in Christianity and the beliefs of our ancestors and forefathers. They've thought about all of these issues very deeply and given us, plenty of letters and books and Federalist Papers to navigate these issues. But the reality is most people are not going to read those. They're going to read memes online. 80% of people. And as a believer in elite theory, that's not really that big of a deal for me. I don't think they're fundamentally in the driver's seat at the end of the day. I think they're just having fun sharing memes and shit posting. So I think the concern's a little overblown. I think there's always room to go too far, but to me, I think it's being wielded as a weapon against people like J.D. Vance more than it being an actual concern.
I don't want to derail this too much talking about the founding fathers, but when you were talking about Christianity, we do have to make it clear that if we are mentioning things like elite theory, for instance, a lot of these founding fathers were looking back towards classical Greece and classical Rome, and they were looking towards the Renaissance. They were looking towards the times when more of this Faustian man was able to conquer and rule over people who themselves may have been Christian, but they themselves were not really, you could say that they were theists, whatever that means, but they were people who were already, especially people like Thomas Jefferson, looking beyond the standard great chain of being idea of reality. I think like they were able to get away with looking at things maybe a lot more so than people who were just, regular people who were living off the land. But I bet that even those people living off the land, like the traditional European Anglo-Saxon yeoman, even they, I think, inherited some of that quality. And this actually goes right to the point that I was making with audience capture, because if we have a Christian society that is in the classic backward sense, I guess, like in the Russian serfdom, for instance, like people who are completely separate from any kind of higher order thinking, they're just completely superstitious, and the only thing they know is that God is like the police, and they have to behave themselves. That's not going to be a recipe for, I would say, an enlightened, in a good sense, kind of country where we are able to transcend wherever we are right now. So it kind of does go back to this question of which direction is the right wing of the United States going? Is it going into the direction of being nuanced, not in the sense that, well, we're going to let all these invaders in because we want to be fair, and maybe we'll figure out a way, to judge them later on. But is there a way to keep the kind of balance where, let's say, General Washington, he probably would have done things to most of the people in Congress right now that would make a lot of our modern day pundits faint, He would be extremely brutal to all the people that a lot of the people on the right today consider to be traitors. He would be absolutely, I think, on the side of the people who say that these people are traitors, and he would treat them accordingly as such. At the same time, though, I don't think he would be in favor of having this theocracy in the United States. And there's like the nuance, right? Like, how do we get the right kind of force, which I think, Michael, you would also be in favor of if that kind of force is necessary in order to defend the West? How do we get the right kind of force without dragging everybody down into the muck of just like complete dogmatism?
Well, and that's a great point about George Washington being, in all modern terms, he would essentially be a Christian nationalist compared to, your average politician. And I think the new right generally is just advocating a return to more historic forms of governance. But understanding that we don't want a theocracy. I don't think that many people really advocate for that seriously. But I think the new right's goal is returning to a real political environment that's really hasn't existed post World War II.
So you interpret it almost like a reincarnation of the Tea Party to some extent?
Yeah, I think that the Tea Party is probably a little more libertarian than I would generally support. But I would say, I think getting to Lev's point about which way is the new right going to go. And the problem is liberalism as a whole has completely decimated all of our cultural traditions. And so we no longer have a virtuous people. And then we're importing people that have basically no sense of American values. And so that's why the new right, probably their number one policy point is we need to deport a ton of people. We need to make America have a unified culture again if we're going to have any chance of maintaining this as a country, as opposed to some balkanized economic zone. And so I think generally the establishment conservative Tea Party, they're steeped in ideology and not practical politics of what is best for the American people. But we have to conform to this modern ideology where we need things like free trade and mass immigration because that's good for corporate profits. And ideologically, it's libertarian. I listened to a Milton Friedman speech, and that's like the cornerstone of my entire philosophy is making more widgets, making the American empire larger and larger without any real consideration to how does this impact Americans who we should actually be representing.
And just to be clear, Crusader Pepe, with this comment from Limpy 12, First Commandment, you shall have no gods before me, versus First Amendment, religion, speech, press, assembly, and the right to petition the government. It seems like this kind of responsibility that the Anglo-Saxon Protestants had in this country when it was first founded, that is a lot of responsibility to be able to assemble, have the press, petition your government. It's not this top-down dictatorship where you have like these serfs in the bottom and the king on the top, right? But in order for people to have that kind of quality, the kind of quality that would be responsible with freedom, you would need for people to be at a certain level, which goes to your point about immigration, right? That we got to make sure that the people who are here in this country can live up to this level. But where I would disagree with you is that if we look at the kind of liberties that were enshrined in our Constitution, that in itself is a liberal thing. That is something that I would consider, I don't know,
Sure.
I don't know exactly if Michael, you would agree with me, but those would be classically liberal principles as long as the people imbue the same spirit that the founding fathers expected of the people in this country. Is that something, Michael, that we can agree on?
Yeah, I mean, I think generally speaking, I think it's important that we have an educated populace and that we are bringing people into the country that at the minimum do not hate our country, right? But where I get into disagreement with the new right or certain people on the just MAGA side are, things like we're losing to Zoran Mamdani in the election. Now let's talk about deporting him. It's like, it gets to like, kind of sore loser levels with some of this stuff. Like, I think we need to put up better candidates in cases like that. And I think I'm absolutely in favor of strong immigration policy. But when you talk about like, we need to deport a lot of people, like, I'm like, I have a lot of questions. Like, what exactly does that mean? What does that look like? I hear some people on the new right talk about deporting legal immigrants, right? So I wonder what that looks like. I have conversations with some people. It's very racialized, right? Like, we need to deport Indian immigrants. We need to deport, immigrants back to Mexico, like specifically. I think for me, I'm principally concerned about radical Islam, right? That's part of the reason I'm supportive of Israel, but which we can get into next if you want. But I guess I just have a lot of questions because I think at the end of the day, I don't know if I'd call myself a compassionate conservative, but I'm a conservative and I'm compassionate to some extent, and I so I don't know that I would get on board with all of this, but certainly, strict immigration policy I think is super important, and deportations are super important. But I want to know where you want that line to be.
And Michael, before we go forward, you do agree that the founding fathers were classically liberal, right? You would define them as such.
Yeah.
Okay. And Crusader Pepe, you would also agree that they are classically liberal, or no? Before we keep going.
So generally, yes, but I think the real issue here is maybe a view of political reality. And that political reality is, if we want to maintain a country that adheres to those liberal principles that, I would argue many of the founding fathers' beliefs were liberal in nature. To do that, you have to have a society that is relatively homogeneous. And if we drift away from a society that does not have similar views, at least at some fundamental level, like different countries view things like time very differently from an Anglo perspective. They view
but I did have breakfast this morning.
Yes, you did have breakfast this morning. And the reality is, if we drift further from that and we approach an empire status, meaning we have all these different people groups that do not have a common religious belief, political beliefs, then you are going to end up in a position where you do need a strong man that stops individual groups from destroying each other. And that doesn't mean I want that or like that. That is the reality of the situation.
Yeah, you see that as the only choice.
I think the new right generally wants to take the off-ramp and make the country more homogeneous from a belief perspective, from a religious perspective, from a heritage perspective. Because of that, they want to maintain the American founding. And if you have a bunch of people that have just come over from Somalia that have really no concept of what an American is and what America stands for, then you have a real problem. Because I just saw a day or two ago, there's these different Somalian tribes in Minneapolis that they didn't vote for the guy who was running for mayor because he was from a different Somalian tribe, right?
Yeah.
And so the question is, and Michael and I would probably disagree with this, is how quickly do people assimilate? And I would say people can assimilate, but it's over probably 4, 5 plus generations. And so if you want to maintain the cultural identity of America and the founding principles, we're just not going to be able to do it under our current demographic breakdown, the amount of immigration we've had, and that will result in a strong man. And I don't particularly love that, but I think that's a political reality.
I think the extent to which they assimilate is also dependent on the volume, right? So if there's tons and tons of people from Somalia coming at once, as opposed to one family, the one family is going to have to assimilate more than 1,000 families, right? Because they can just coexist with each other. And so, I agree with some of that. I just, I wonder how exactly like we want to go about accomplishing that. I also wonder about, like we are a country with, freedom of expression, freedom of religion, right? So it kind of makes it a little hard, I think, to some extent when we start talking about things like this, because it's like, oh no, they never envisioned that, Muslims would come over. Well, set aside the fact that Jefferson had a Quran and all these other things. It's like, I mean, they knew about Muslims. It's like, can't you make that same argument if you're a liberal at that point and say like, oh, well, they didn't know about AR-15s. You know what I'm saying?
Sure.
So it's like we have to
there is one weird trick. There is one weird trick that could be used when we're talking about Islam, which is to define it not as a religion, but as a political system. And here comes the trouble, because if we have this completely perfect system of submission that's been passed down since the Middle Ages, where they have all these different schools of jurisprudence that nevertheless agree on the fact that you have Dar al-Islam, the House of Islam, and you have Dar al-Harb, which is the House of War, which is any secular non-Islamic state, which in the end must be eventually conquered through either civilizational jihad, or like physically going to war. that kind of mindset in no way can ever blend together with any Western civilization. And it's not the fault of the individual Muslim. It's just a fact. It just physically cannot. And once reasonable people understand this to be the case, then we could actually make some, actual progress when it comes to this kind of issue. But I want to bring up the concept which Dr. Jason Rezajurjani, a good friend of the show, he was on recently, he used this term, which I think would fit in really well in terms of what we're talking about here, which is ethos. So ethos would be the deep character of a civilization. It wouldn't be its religion. It wouldn't be its ideology. It would be, think of it more of like a civilizational soul. It's the innate pattern of being in the world which shapes how people relate to nature, technology, destiny, and even something like divinity. And that kind of ethos is something that is not exclusive to any kind of biological group. Like different biological groups of people can be able to get to that level of the ethos, but at the same time, this is something that needs to be agreed upon. And it's incredibly hard to do at first, but eventually there should be a way for us to be able to recognize, okay, are these people operating according to the same ethos? And if not, then what happens? But then, to your point, Michael, things start getting really hairy when we're talking about, well, how many people in this country even have this ethos to begin with,
Right.
Like, and at that point, well, what exactly do we do? And if our end goal is to have people that are, let's say, 90% on board, and it doesn't mean that they're all supposed to be like a bunch of geniuses, but they're at least on board with having this ethos, which may require people to be a certain level of intelligence. Doesn't mean they have to be Albert Einstein, but they do have to get to a certain level. If we can agree that if we don't have the majority of people at that level, then society is eventually going to fall apart in terms of how many people are born who are not at that level. Like, if we can make that prediction right now, and if we can agree upon that, then what do we do from there? Are we saying that we are going to be completely separate from the most horrible things, which actually are an incredibly common part of history, until things get too comfy? Are we going to completely separate ourselves from the idea that history is going to continue and imagine that this could be solved without bringing history back? Or do we start thinking about it in a really sober way in order to mitigate the amount of horribleness that is going to occur once these changes are going to be made in order to prevent civilizational collapse? So let's start with Michael and then Crusader Pepe.
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of like an ethos, like I'd love to see something integrated into like the way we do citizenship tests for new immigrants, like thinking about that much more, deeply, thinking about having something like that for when we graduate high school, right? Things like that, like sending people off into adulthood and citizenship. And I think that, personally, like I'm much more concerned from a civilizational perspective on, mass immigration from Middle East and North Africa, right? Like Islamic countries, than I am almost anywhere else, right? By and large, many of the people coming from Mexico are Christian, right? Catholic. And in fact, much of, Latin America. And so I do think that there's a component of that it should make assimilation somewhat easier. Again, it's a question of volume and scale, and right, how, to what extent we're kind of self-segregating and so forth. But that's kind of what I think about that. Yeah.
Well, and at this point, we've been dealing with probably 75 years of what I would say is modern liberalism. And what I mean by that is, we had the revolution of the 60s where we burned down pretty much all traditions, whether it's Christianity, civic traditions, normal gender roles and responsibilities between, a husband and a wife. And so in some respect, we're kind of a fatherless child at this point. And you're right. Is there even an ethos at this point? I mean, I would say it's rapidly dissipating. And so I think the first thing that has to be done is we have to define, what is an American? I think that question is really, has to be answered in some capacity, is what does America stand for? And I think until we actually figure that out, I don't think we should have any kind of meaningful legal immigration. And I think anyone that's here illegally should be deported as the law dictates. And so I think that's actually a pretty moderate position. And I'm not saying there should be no immigration. Maybe there's a little bit here and there, but generally I don't think we should have any more, because if we do, we are going to completely balkanize eventually, because you're going to have different people that basically we've moved, we've made a mini Somalia in Minnesota. And that's happening with a bunch of different ethnic groups in different cities. It's happening in Texas. It's happening in blue states and red states. And so I don't think it's particularly bad. I don't think it's about hating those people or hating, I don't blame anyone for wanting to come to America, but I think at some point we have to ask the question, is it worth importing all these people when we don't even know who we really are at this point?
Do we not? I don't know.
I don't think so.
Yeah. Well,
I mean,
if we're talking about people who have their own enclaves, which the founding fathers again warned about, this kind of clannish type of a factionalism, obviously that's no good. I think we can both agree on that. The more nuanced issue has to do with what is the percentage of people in this country today, especially in certain enclaves, like you were mentioning in Minnesota with Somalians. What is the percentage of people today who live so much in the moment that 90% of them are not capable of thinking beyond a certain amount of time in order to make the kind of decisions that can keep civilization functioning at the right level? Because I think, like, deep down, this is something that does concern a lot of people who are looking into the future. And again, this says nothing about the individual, because you can have an individual. Obviously, we've had loads of examples of people who come from Nigeria, for instance, who are, excellent when it comes to education and, jobs and yada, yada, yada. No problem there at all. So it's not this, some kind of a, racial determinism bullshit. What we are talking about, though, is this kind of almost house of mirrors, hive mind, reinforcing patterns over decades and over generations, when it gets to be so much that you have a whole bunch of people that are not really thinking about, what exactly is going to happen in like 5 years, 10 years. If they're not planning ahead, then I don't know if they're going to be able to maintain in the long term the kind of things that we're taking for granted today, that resulted in this wonderful country that we have right now. And that is an issue that I haven't really seen that many people talk about openly and try to figure out, okay, how are we going to deal with this?
Well, and Mondami's a perfect example of that. He didn't win because he's necessarily Muslim. I mean, he has female staffers. He's not like this traditional Shia law Muslim. His role is to essentially transfer resources from Americans to his different groups in New York City. Which has a huge foreign-born population. He won that election not because he's a communist or socialist. I mean, that's maybe part of it. But the reality is he got an outsized share of the foreign vote because he promises to reward his friends. And it's not about kind of these more ideological things. It's much more tribal in nature, which is something that Americans, or I would say heritage Americans that have been here for a long time, really don't have antibodies against. They don't know how to deal with it because, as you mentioned, the founders set up America so that would not be as significant of a problem. And most of the people here were of a similar stock, a similar religious belief. And so while there's some tribal issues in America's history, it's not as severe as what we're seeing now. And I really think that's the question of our day is trying to get outside of this ideological thinking and certain groups of Americans not acting in a tribal way, because they're going to get forced into it eventually if all these illegal immigrants stay here, and these people that haven't assimilated have just as much voting power as them. Eventually, heritage Americans are going to go, we have to be tribal now. Otherwise, we're going to get wiped out. We're going to have our resources looted, and maybe worse.
And I think you're seeing more of that in like Western Europe and like England in particular, Ireland, Northern Ireland.
Yep.
I'm in Poland. It's not, it's very homogenous. I'm sure you're familiar with Poland a bit. Very Catholic. I happen to be Catholic, right? And that's one big example from American history of, a lot of people were suspicious of Catholics, were suspicious of JFK, right?
Roman popery. You remember Gangs of New York?
Yeah, Gangs in New York. Like,
I still need to watch that.
You got to watch
good movie.
that. Yeah. But I think his father couldn't even get into a certain club at Harvard because he was Catholic and all these things. And fundamentally, like my politics is not identitarian. Like to the extent that I have concerns about Islam, which I've mentioned now, it's sort of based on what Lev was kind of alluding to with this kind of desire. And you had another guest on at one point. He was talking about how in 2075 there'll be a Muslim majority in the world, something like that.
Oh yeah, that's Jason Giorgiani. That was the
So that's a big concern, right? And I think that that's not about identitarianism, right? Like in fact, my concern about Mamdani is less about his being Muslim and more about his politics, right? Because as you mentioned, Crusader, like he goes to like drag shows or drag brunches or whatever, and he has female staff. Like he's obviously not like a fundamentalist Muslim. Like to
be fair though, the guest you just mentioned, Dr. Giorgiani, he sees this as being complete taqiyya. Meaning lying for the sake of preserving the religion. And he brings up specific examples. What I found really interesting about this conversation, he brings up examples of certain people in Iran right before the 1979 revolution who themselves are more in presence commies. They were people who were in favor of a lot of these social justice reforms. But then at the same time, if not for those people, the Ayatollah would have never gone into power. They were the ones that opened the door, even though they saw themselves as being like, or they were seen as being like these, commie, leftist, Soviet sympathizer type people. And that's the real difficulty with Mamdani, because on one hand, I saw this really interesting article written about him where it talks about how his family descends from people who were in India who were originally of the Nizari Ismaili sect of Islam, which is a very interesting sect because not only are they Shia, but they are specifically part of what was the Order of the Assassins back in the day, which could be, for all intents and purposes, not even Islamic, but a crypto-Mithrist cult, which wore the skin suit of Islam back in the day, and they did things, for example, like, I know this is kind of going in the weeds, but it's pretty interesting. There was this guy, Hassan Saba II, who was in the Order of Assassins, who, when he was making his speech, he was addressing it not only to the people, but like to the fairies and the jinn and all this kind of stuff. Like, these are people who were much more interesting than these very dogmatic type Islamic movements. But anyway, eventually Mamdani's family was forced to convert into the Twelver faith, which is the idea that you have, the succession of the Prophet Muhammad goes to Ali, as it does for all the Shiites, unlike the Sunnis who believe that then it went to Abu Bakr, Muhammad's son-in-law, who was also, by the way, the father of the 9-year-old Aisha that Muhammad ended up marrying. And Ali, I believe, was Muhammad's cousin. So anyway, to make a long story short, the Twelvers believe that there are these 12 imams, and the 12th one is like the hidden imam who's only going to reveal himself at the end of days. And in Iran, their particular branch of this faith, which is different from the one in Iraq, emphasizes the need to make it so that the soil is fertile enough for there to be this apocalypse, this end of the world. Like, they want the end of the world to happen. They want Israel to attack Iran in order to bring on the Mahdi, which is considered to be like their equivalent of the Messiah. And anyway, there's this whole thing going on. But the point here is that it seems like Mamdani is both, this more hippy-dippy kind of Nizari faith, and at the same time, the faith that they converted into, the 12 are Shiites, which are a lot more strict. But I agree with Giorgiani. I think that he is more or less using this hippie dippiness to appeal to a lot of these dumbass voters, and then eventually the other side of him is going to bring on a lot more serious Muslims into positions of power in New York City, which nobody sensible would ever want.
Yeah, I agree with you. And just to wrap up my point here, so like very valid concerns about Islam that I totally agree with. Again, that's a big part of the reason I support Israel. But I think in general, my politics are not identitarian. So I don't look at I'm not saying of the belief that an American is a certain race or religious belief.
Mm-hmm.
I think I think it's good to be somewhat homogenous, right? I mean, I think it's good to have some connection back to our past, right? For a majority of the country, but like California and Texas aren't they already basically majority Hispanic, right? Or very close. I'm kind of I kind of feel like a hypocrite a little talking about this because I'm from New England, which is the whitest part of America, and now I live in Poland, which is the whitest country in Europe,
and also the most lived out, by the way, like the New England area. I mean, that's kind of funny, where you have all the BLM signs and everything like that. Meanwhile, you're living in Elysium in comparison to so many places in the country.
Yeah, but just principally, that's how I.
And I think that's probably, you're highlighting a very big difference between, I would say, what is now establishment conservatism and the new right. I think the new right is generally more identitarian. Mm-hmm. And I think at some level, I think identity politics is actually just reality. And this is where people like James Lindsay will say, oh, that's woke right. And I think it's just a more realistic view of the facts on the ground. I don't think it needs to be this ethnic hatred of different groups when we say identity politics. But I think the understanding that the new right has is that of any cohort that's especially recently moved to America, is they're going to generally operate as an ethnic group, as an identity. And it's not to say that they can never assimilate and that they can never be an American, but generally a large majority of that group, 80% plus, is going to vote on identitarian lines because their interests generally are going to overlap. And I think I understand the concern of establishment conservatives saying, this can get out of hand if it becomes too identitarian. And that's true. But I would also say that the people that are coming here are extremely identitarian and don't apologize for it. And what will happen is, if their one group is not playing on that field, and generally that's white people, they don't operate as identitarian as the other groups, and that's just statistically true. And so once again, what our main concern is it's eventually we're going to be forced into this identitarian politics, and it's going to look a lot worse than just voting. And I think that's a big disagreement that we probably have, is because I used to have your exact same position. Identity politics are bad. Mm-hmm. But as time has gone by, it just seems to be a reality, like the sky being blue, is people that have a similar background are going to operate in a similar way, at least under a normal lifetime or generations. Maybe over 100 years, 200 years, you'll see groups start to come together and operate as a single entity. But I think if you look at things on a 25, 50, 100-year time horizon, it's going to cause a lot of division and therefore probably a lot of destruction. And we've already seen that through things like the BLM riots in 2020, or other events. We have these ethnic conflicts that sometimes don't even involve Americans, period. And that's what I think we're trying to avoid. And the toothpaste might be out of the tube, but and some people probably have bad motives for that, for how they're approaching it, that are probably sinful. But I think there's a lot of people who are just looking at it as a political reality and trying to make the best path forward.
I have a question. Would you guys say that when it comes to this ethos that I mentioned earlier, the founding fathers, which eventually led to the natives, again, to talk about that movie, which you haven't seen yet, Crusader Pepe, Gangs of New York, the nativists were WASPs mostly. They were against the Irish. They were against, probably the Jews as well, the Italians. Yep. But eventually those groups ended up finding their ceiling within society. And part of me wonders how much it ended up working out so well, not in spite of, but because of there being this big dick wagging that the WASPs were doing at the time because they were in power, meaning that everybody understood the deal that this is what we need to conform to, or else these people are never going to respect us. So, even though they did have their cultural enclaves and the various political machines that wanted to grab votes from these particular blocks, there was still this emphasis that eventually, if you want to move up in the world, there is going to have to be this kind of standard you're going to have to conform into. Now, I don't even know if we're living in an age where something like that is possible, but I don't know, like Michael, do you see there being a potential here for...
Well, what's interesting is one of the first proponents of America First as a concept was that I can recall in history is Woodrow Wilson, who's someone that most conservatives absolutely loathe, right? And in 1916, he ran for re-election on an America First ticket and was reelected and proceeded to get right into World War I. And, he was trying to stay out of the war, supposedly. And one thing that they did during the war that Wilson did was it? I'm trying to remember. Was it the Espionage Act, or am I thinking of Adams? Anyway, so I think I'm thinking of Adams. But basically, they went around and they took care of a lot of the sort of German enclaves and so forth, right? Because they were obviously antagonists in the war, and they took care of things like German language newspapers, right? All sorts of things. And so, I don't know the percentage of like German immigrants in the 1800s or like Italian immigrants, like what percentage of them like spoke English and how fast, but those are the kinds of things like, if it were theoretically possible to have like a law for like citizenship that you have to speak English, like I could have a conversation about something like that, or something like, and certainly having a strong border, having deportations. But where I start to have a bit more friction personally is when we start to talk about, legal immigrants, and when we talk about other things, because I don't think there's anything that precludes most people from being able to assimilate, especially if, they need to learn English, especially if, but I think the way things are set up now in places like Minneapolis is you can set up a mini Somalia, you can set up a mini China, New York, or whatever, and you can kind of live in that little Disneyland version of your home country.
Along with the CCP police officers that drag Chinese dissidents back to the home country in Chinatown there.
Well, and in Dearborn, they have Muslim police officers with Muslim writing on their badge, right? So it's so I think that's a big problem, right? Like we need to actually, kind of, I don't want to say force, but like we need to assuage like sort of the assimilation a little bit more. Maybe not to the extent that like Wilson did all the way, or with like the Germans in World War I, but like that is kind of a funny parallel that like he ran on that America First ticket and
And Lev, to your point, I think largely the nativists were generally right about their concerns, but you're right, that pressure did force assimilation. And if you think of, because the Irish, the Italians, they all developed their own neighborhoods, but eventually they did assimilate. And I think what we're seeing now is that the type of immigrants that are coming here, there's a much larger gap between an Irishman or a German and someone from Somalia. And so I think if it took the Irish and Italians multiple generations to assimilate with pressure, the type of immigrants we're bringing here now, it's going to take them longer because they have a much different cultural background, but now they don't even have any pressure to assimilate in any major way. And so I think that's one of the things that is so, I think that the new right cares about so much is, and why it is about identitarian politics, because none of that forced assimilation is happening, and there's a much larger gap to bridge. And I think it sounds like we generally agree on that, Michael.
But it's not strictly ethnicity, right? Because obviously, like, you're open to people who share your values that happen to be of Indian descent or so forth, right? Because I even see on the new right, there are people like Nikki Haley's son is like involved. He's obviously of Indian descent. Then there's like, what's his name? Vish Burra, and like people
Vish. By the way, Vish has been on the show many times.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So I know of him. I don't know much about it, but
it's a fun guy.
So basically, like, what I'm trying to understand about this is it's identitarian, but it's more about values, right? Like,
yes. And I would say the people you're listing are an exception to the rule, though.
Okay.
Because they're very unique, right? You were able to name very specific people that have actually in many ways assimilated, even if not entirely. I don't believe Vish is a Christian. I'm a big fan of his. We're mutuals on X, but so I think that's the real problem. Is it's the exception, and it isn't strictly based off of ethnicity or race or anything like that. But if we look at it practically, it is just a much bigger gap to assimilate someone who comes from just a radically different world. Like when people visit Japan, they go, "Wow, this is so unique and different," because it is unique and different. And I think that's the crux of the issue. Is it's about averages in reality, and on average, per capita matters. And when you think of like per capita, when someone comes here from Ireland, how quickly will they assimilate? Very quickly on average. If they come from India or China or Japan, how quickly will they assimilate? The reality is it's probably going to be much longer, much more difficult. There's a much larger language barrier.
With language barrier for Japan, yes, but in general, I think Japan has borrowed so much from the West, especially like if we're looking after the Meiji Restoration, that they would be pretty quick on the draw when it comes to doing the kind of things that people in the West would highly appreciate, sometimes even doing it better in some cases.
And there's going to be a major difference between every country and every group. Sometimes there's multiple groups within a single country that are going to be wildly different. And so that's why I think having a citizenship test and very, very specific processes to integrate people is where that becomes the key of immigration. But that being said, I think we've been messing it up for so long that we just need to put for the most part a 99% pause on all of it.
So would you support a quota like before Hart-Celler? Like, is that what you want to get back to, like quotas for specific countries?
Yeah. I mean, I think quotas, values-based, religion-based admittance, and we can talk about the constitutionality of that. I'm certainly not a lawyer, and frankly, I don't really care about the constitutionality of some of these things, because it's more a question of what needs to be done at this point versus us operating in kind of like this post-Civil Rights Act constitution that's really replaced the Constitution in many ways.
Well, and that's what concerns me with a lot of the conversations I have, because I was thinking about Calvin Robinson, the friar from, I think he's from the UK. Like, he commented on a post the other day. I was talking about, something about, I think I said that if the Republican Party goes in the direction of the Groypers, like, probably say goodbye to many of the independents, right? Especially if they're associating Groyper's New Right, whatever you want to call it, with Fuentes' statements about Hitler and other things, right? I think that's just probably true. And he commented, I didn't reply, he said something like, if they win, you won't have to worry about it, or something. And it was this ominous, like, comment from the friar about, implying there won't be democracy or something like that, right? It's kind of how I took it. And I do hear this from other people. So I was on the phone with a guy that identifies as New Right the other day. And I was asking him about some of the things he specifically wants to do. And he said, we can have democracy when we have our country back. And I got really, like, so this is what makes me concerned about this stuff, because I hear these, like, notions of, like, are we going to have elections? Like what is it that you actually want?
Well, so that brings up a good point is, I'm sure you've heard the quote that Trump posted, he who violates the law but saves the nation does not violate the law, or something like that, right? And we've been operating so far out of the constitutional republic architecture that this country was founded on, that the modern interpretation and view of it, to get the older version of that back, you will have to operate outside of the current constitutional framework to have any chance of restoring that older order. And once again, I fully acknowledge that can be a slippery slope, but I think the reality is and you probably agree with this as being a conservative, is the Constitution really hasn't been operating, and the country hasn't been operating as intended for a long time. And so we'll have to operate outside the bounds of probably what is quote unquote current judicial precedent. But a lot of that would just be returning to a more originalist interpretation of the Constitution. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, to me, it sounds like the path to a civil war, right? Like, it doesn't sound like something that we could just do. Like, okay, we're just going to do this extrajudicial thing, ignore the Supreme Court, ignore the Constitution. Like, to me, that doesn't seem like something that Democrats or many Americans in general will just let us do.
Michael, what would be the way out if you were to oppose what Crusader Pepe is talking about? What would be the actual way out of this if we're being extremely sober about the realities, whether we're talking about the demographics, whether we're talking about the judges that are in positions of power right now that act as fifth columns in certain cases? If we're talking about these things that are not able to be fixed in any other way except for there being a horrible, horrible conflict that the three of us would never actually want to ever happen, then what choice is there? What is the path forward without getting into what Crusader Pepe is talking about?
Well, hasn't Holman talked about hiring 100,000 more ICE agents, things like that? Like obviously, I think just if you get rid of the filibuster, which I'm more in the conservative camp of, like, let's try to codify it, right? Because I'd rather no one gets rid of it. But if we're saying we need to make big changes, there's no better way to do that than get rid of the filibuster and start doing things, right? Especially with, now we're on the path to the midterms. And then after that, who knows, like, what we're going to be able to do, right? And so,
can you explain that a little bit for the people who don't understand what exactly is this filibuster and so on and so forth?
So the Senate filibuster means you need 60 votes. So in theory, it's a good thing, because it means you need more bipartisan support. So the legislation is perhaps needs to be better for more people, right, or something that more people would agree on. But in reality, it just ends up kind of preventing a lot of bills from being passed, because we're in such a polarized environment that it's hard to get 6 or 7 or 8 or however many Democratic votes to go along with all the Republicans, even if they all stay in line, which doesn't always happen, right? And so so the filibuster would make it, if you remove that, it's just a simple majority to pass a bill. And so then you can start really passing a lot more legislation fast. And so Trump and many others right now are really pushing to eliminate the filibuster, but it doesn't seem like enough senators support that. And the question is, will the Democrats eliminate it if and when they come back to power, and then just simply do the same thing? So the other option that I propose is to codify it with a constitutional amendment, but that in itself is probably highly theoretical, because you would need 3/5 of state house support plus 2/3 of both chambers, something like that. So but that's the way to start passing a lot of bills and making a big difference with things.
Let's play that out. Let's play that out in several parts. So part one, the filibuster ends up getting what you were talking about with the filibuster ends up being gotten rid of. So now the people in charge have a lot more leeway. Okay, what is next in the way? What's the next Gordian knot as far as, okay, now Republicans have the ability to do all these wonderful things. Well, how much would they actually be able to do to ensure that the actual civilization that we're living in is still going to be not just around, but is going to be thriving quite well, 30, 40, 50 years from now? It's a tough question, right?
We got to agree on the problem, and then we got to agree on a solution, right?
Yeah.
And then it's got to get past the Supreme Court if it gets if that becomes an issue, right? So it's definitely a problem, but I think that there are things that we can agree on, like both wings or whatever. And again, I'm really not here like representing like the Mitt Romney side or whatever. Sometimes I get put on that side. I voted for Trump. Like so we're closer than we think, but I think we need to agree on specifics of like what exactly is the problem. Because again, I see massive immigration pouring over the southern border as a problem, whether they're white, Hispanic, black, it's a problem. It's not because they're Hispanic, right? Necessarily for me. And so we got to agree on what the problem is and then what the solution is.
Could we say that one problem that all three of us can agree on is that there is a certain percentage of people, forget skin color, forget where they're from, there's a certain percentage of people who, if we're talking about demographic rates 30, 40, 50 years from now, they're not at the level of ethos or whatever term we want to use here to be able to keep civilization running as smoothly as it's been running for the past 100 or so years. Is that something that we can agree on or no? And if not, what can we show that is not the case? And if yes, what can we show that is the case? Because I think if we take all of the racial stuff away, regardless of where people are from, there is this fear that if too many people are just thinking in the moment who are in this country right now, they're not really going to have what it takes to maintain all of this intricacy of Western civilization. And I could be wrong, but that really seems to be like the core concern.
Yeah. Do you want to answer?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So my general thinking on what you said, Michael, is I think you're operating in this frame where you're operating under the rules of the system that the left has circumvented through the managerial state. What I mean by that is a vast bureaucracy that basically implements
sorry, Crusader Pepe, your audio is really bad right now. I don't know what's going on. There could be a connection issue. Michael, is Crusader Pepe's audio bad? There seems to be some stuff in the background. Let me see. I'm going to temporarily mute Crusader Pepe and see if... Yeah, so there is some background noise in Crusader Pepe's environment right now. Crusader Pepe, make sure you go somewhere where there's not going to be that noise, because it's doubling up the audio. It's doing some weird stuff with the audio. But while Crusader Pepe's figuring that out, I want to bring that question to you, Michael. When it does come to this fear, and I hope I defined it as accurately as I could, this fear that people, the majority of whom are going to be in this country, are not really going to have what it takes to keep all these wonderful things going, just because there's not enough of them that would be able to think far enough in advance in order to just maintain the infrastructure and maintain the trading. And also the people who are going to be in more managerial positions, they're not really going to have what it takes to maintain, the businesses correctly. I don't know. That seems to be the inherent fear, which could be completely unfounded, but I think that's really where it lies.
To me, I try to be realistic, but also not fatalistic. And I think, I have faith in the American people that we will, perhaps start to get our fertility rates up. Some of this ties to spirituality, and there's all kinds of reports about increases in church attendance lately and things like this. And so I certainly hope that some of that starts to turn around, like in general. And I don't think that that's our lifetime issue. What you're kind of inferring there. Like I think that over the long term, yes, and like we need to fix our fertility rates like around the globe. Like it seems like the population is growing fast, like on a global scale, but it's mostly in the so-called third world, right? Like, and so we need to definitely address that. Like in Poland, they just passed a law starting next year. People with 2 kids, I have 2 kids, don't pay income tax, right? Which actually is twice as sort of aggressive as Hungary's law, which I think is 4 kids, right? And Hungary has
4
a
Kids
strong
Entertainment.
man. What's that? Yeah.
Remember 4 Kids Entertainment? It was they dubbed anime back in the day. You remember Dragon Ball Z? And anyways, it's dumb. Okay, keep going.
Anyway.
Sorry about that.
So Hungary's policy is not as sort of progressive as Poland's policy or aggressive, but Hungary has this strong man. And I was talking to someone today, Thomas Hose, because he had a piece in the Dispatch about kind of this problem, and about, I think the piece was called "No to the Incel Republic," and it was talking about birth rates and things like this. And I told him about this fact about Poland, because they just recently passed this. And because he kind of associated this law with having a strong man like Orban. And I told him like Poland, I don't know, do we really have a strong man like president? I don't think so. Nawrocki, I don't really think of him as.
Well, you have strong people. That I think is the
yes, the world
but isn't that the whole idea where we're talking about the founding fathers and how the people who were the yeomen back then, the ones who participated in the Revolutionary War, they were strong people. They were responsible people.
For sure.
And unfortunately, when I look at India, and obviously there's a lot of wonderful Indian immigrants that come here and they're, super impressive and all of that. I'm sorry, but I can't get out of my head the idea that all the trash that's piling up in so many places in, India's, especially urban environment, all of those pieces of trash at a certain point in time, it was just like a little decision that was made by one person where, do I put this in a certain bin or do I put this out in the street? Multiplied by 1 million, right? So these are like micro decisions. And the question is, well, what influenced people to make those particular micro decisions on a daily basis? What they learned from their family, right? Like what they learned were all a house of mirrors. What they learned from the people that are all around them in order to have this particular hive mind, where in Japan, for instance, it's the complete opposite. Everybody would be so scared of being shamed, even just like shamed by their own soul if they were to litter, right?
Yeah.
So there is this thing where we need to encourage the latter as opposed to the former in some way. And people usually, like, let's say, I don't know, in Poland, I don't know how much trash piles up in Poland. I don't assume that much. I assume people take care of
the birds take it out.
Yeah, birds take it out. Yeah. Exactly. So I assume that people are more responsible, not just because of randomness, but because this is the culture that they grew up in and they were influenced by certain things, which is why if we're talking about, well, what is the future of the United States, it's very important that the people who occupy the majority of the United States are raised in such a way that they would never even think of, throwing just something, across the street. It wouldn't occur to them. And the question is, well, how much are we willing to let things become incredibly horrible for a little while and incredibly violent and yada, 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 in order to ensure that kind of future?
It's easier to build boys than to mend men. You ever heard that before?
No, that's an interesting expression. Yeah.
I think it's from Truett Cathy, was the guy who said that. And so I feel like I'm in control of my own kids. Like I can teach them right from wrong. I've got a son and a daughter, 3 years old, 1 year old.
Well,
And
congratulations.
thank you. And we had both of them. My wife and I were 29 years old. We got married at 25. So we're kind of against the trends, I think, a little bit, or a little ahead of schedule. We'd like to have more kids, but we can only control. We can't force anyone else to have kids, right? It's we can set a good example and show people maybe occasionally on Instagram or something, like, see how cute this baby is. You want one, right? You should go have one. Like, but we can't, generally like we all have to have some kind of individual responsibility. And if we care about, preserving, whatever, certain people in the US, like we have to start having kids. We have to stop, hooking up till we're 37 years old or whatever it is. And then, I can't have a baby anymore. Like we have to fix some of these issues, right? Like in this piece today, I read a lot of articles today. I think it was the one in the Dispatch, but it mentioned that the Catholic Church, banned, was it ancestry? And then it was talking about, the history of polygamy and things like that. And so there are advantageous, social, sexual, like policies and things like this. And I think we should consider things, even if they're, quote unquote welfare. Like I know Dana does not like this policy. Like she told me on the show, where you're paying people to have kids. Like, it's cool for us. Like it doesn't make a huge difference, but it's like, okay, like it's a little incentive. But for some people, it might make a really big difference. And so I don't know, policies like that. I suppose something like that already does exist in the United States.
What do you think of the comment here from my friend Galen Didier, who says people don't have kids because they see others having them. They have them when the economic environment works.
Well, it's funny because the people in the world who have the most kids are the ones with the worst economic environments. And the people who have the least kids are the people who have the best economic environments. And so my experience with my wife, I mean, maybe I'm just a wild man, I don't know. But my wife and I got married 7 months after meeting, flew to Croatia, got married at the beginning of COVID, and we had our daughter roughly 2 years after we got married, and then our son last year. And so, I think a lot of people overthink it. Like I see this with my own brother. My brother works for a big corporation in Atlanta. He's all about his career and God bless him. But like he's been dating a girl for a long time. It's like, I think a lot of people just overthink it. And like it is the most important decision of your life, but at the same time, like get to it.
Well, in this sense, you're fighting against the dying of the light, so to speak. Like you are, unfortunately, so a unicorn. But it's actually interesting what you said right now. I'm going to controversially tie back to the question that I asked earlier, because it does remind me of this little movie which you may have heard of called Idiocracy. Are you familiar with that movie?
Bill Maher?
No, not Bill Maher. Idiocracy. Mike Judge, Beavis and Butthead.
Okay. Yes,
so the plot of Idiocracy is that the people who, again, like you, I'd say, are within this group of people, except you're actually rebelling by having kids. But this class of people who are, well-educated, smart people, they end up putting off having kids and eventually not having kids because they're constantly thinking about the future, right? They're not living in the moment. They're thinking about the future. But the people who end up having a lot of kids are the people who don't think about the future, who live in the moment. And so Idiocracy presents this future world where you got a bunch of trash lying everywhere. And the most popular movie that won the Oscar was like, Ow, My Balls, just about a guy getting hit in the balls all the time. And the idea here, it goes back to this question of, well, what do you do about the people who are raised in such a way that they have no problem just throwing the trash outside, much like the movie Idiocracy showed there being all of this trash.
Right, which showed us it's not an ethnic thing necessarily, right?
No.
It's like these are white couples at the beginning of that film.
Sure, I mean, again, I'm from Russia. I'm from Russia originally, and I know that, because I'm a Russian Jew, Russians say like, oh, you can't talk about, the ethnic Russians, whatever. I'm half ethnic Russian. On my dad's side, is like half Russian, half Ukrainian. So
Okay.
with Russia, you actually get a pretty good idea of what idiocracy with white people would be like when it comes to a lot of these Russians living in completely run down, derelict environment with trash everywhere. But
Okay.
if we're talking about the amount of people who emigrate to the United States specifically and to Europe from the Middle East, from parts of Africa, from India, then sure, I could talk about the Russians. But right now, in terms of sheer population growth, the kind of culture that enables the same kind of, leaving the trash out mentality that I just talked about with these Russians, who, by the way, I think the reason why they have this mentality is because they were formerly serfs under the Mongols, and then for a long time under the Russian czars and royal family, who were mostly Europeans. So the point here is that if a lot of people have this kind of mindset that they end up passing on to their children and their family and community, then that's going to be an extremely big problem going forward. And it's not something that we can just close our eyes about. We do have to start thinking in a proactive and also in a moral way. Like, what would be the moral and the proactive and the correct way to ensure that most of the people in this country are never even going to think of leaving that piece of trash, outside for somebody else to take care of later on. That's the goal, right? I think that's a good goal. I think that's a noble goal. But the question is, okay, what do we need to do in order to get to that goal? And if we don't do it, then what is our society going to look like?
Well, you need to try to move away from being a totally hedonistic, selfish, instant gratification society, right? Which is obviously a big challenge. And you can read about, I don't know, I'm thinking about people like Jonathan Haidt and different people like writing about adjacent topics. And, it's tough. Like, I think in some ways you can look at religious faith, like decline. You can look at, maybe rise in nihilism and things like that, accompanying that. I
don't know if the people we're talking about, though, are like that. You're talking about people who may be more within your group, who are nihilistic, who are the ones that are not having kids. I'm talking about the people, a lot of whom are very faithful, like they pray to their gods or they pray to their God. At the same time, they don't really focus on the kind of things that would build civilization up. So we can't avoid the subject. We're going to have to face this. And here's my prediction, and I want to get to Crusader Pepe as well. Here's my prediction. If people who are sensible, like yourself, don't start addressing these things in a really detailed and a really far-thinking way, who will. It's going to be the people that are going to come after, who are not going to be as intelligent as you, who are going to be a lot more rougher, and who are not going to care about any nuance whatsoever. Because at the end of the road, those people are always going to be there, right? We're always going to have, violence, bloodshed. We're going to have the worst of the worst waiting for us at the end of the hall, waving their hand, saying, come on, it's time. So that's what I want to avoid. I'm a classic liberal. I want to avoid those people ever getting into power, but this is the only way that I could think of avoiding them, is by addressing a lot of the stuff that people on the far right are talking about and saying, okay, how much of this is the reality? Is there any way for us to know for sure, at least to a certain extent? And if we know that, well, what do we do now? Because we can't just sit there and, hope it all works out.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. The picture you're painting in my head is like the Bombay, I think it's Bombay, like train station, like overtaken by foliage and stuff like that. That's what I'm thinking of right now.
Crusader Pepe, I think you're back on right now.
Yeah, how's my audio now?
It's fine. Yeah, no problem at all. There's no background noise. I don't know if were you able to hear the conversation we've been having right now?
Yes, yeah, and I think what you said about we're going to have to answer some of these hard questions. I think one of the most important things for increasing the birth rate and having a society that's on the same page is having an affirmative identity, and that's really what America has lost, and that some of that is corrected through political methods, some of it is corrected through social methods, but I think people have kids when they're religious and they have a similar national identity, and I think that's why this conversation that's being had right now is so important is I think the new right is asking, how do we practically get back to this this state where our civilization doesn't just die out from lack of reproduction? And I think that the difficult part is that the left has done a phenomenal job of not playing by the rules, really, and executing their agenda through things like a complex bureaucratic state. That essentially what FDR, essentially revolutionized how the Constitution, how the government operates. And the new right basically is saying we need to have a similar type of revolution, not with the same principles as FDR, but in a similar magnitude. So that way we can implement these changes, so that way we don't die out. And I think the modern conservative establishment is just so focused on playing by the rules, or the filibuster this or filibuster that, when the left hasn't been operating under the same standards for almost a century at this point.
Okay.
Yeah, it's tough.
Yeah, I have an example for you to look to for help with the birth rates. Why don't you look at Israel, because I believe they have the highest birth rates in the West.
There we go.
Well, and that's a great segue. I think that's basically what the new right is. Basically, wants us to be able to have the same ability to have a national identity as Israel. And that's not really a comment about Israel. It just seems like Israel gets to have a very clear ethnic society. Obviously, they have pluralism. There's Muslims that live there. There's people that aren't Jewish or really don't practice.
There's Samaritans. There's Ethiopians. And everybody has the same rights, by the way. That's the other thing. Like, it's not some kind of an ethno state in the sense that, if you're like this, if you're a Jew, then you get to have like all these privileges. No, everybody is equal under the law, which is a very, very important thing.
But at the same time, they also have a very clear national identity. And I think that's basically that America hasn't been allowed to have a similar type of identity, because it's a violation of essentially the Civil Rights Act. You're not allowed to promote certain identities because it's, quote unquote, discriminatory. And I think that's why a lot of people on the new right are so frustrated with the whole Israel situation. There's many different factors at play there, but one of them is just the double standard of they seem to get to have a national identity where America doesn't.
Just to push back a little bit on what you're talking about, Gollin sends the following: Japanese people are nationalist and identitarian. Same thing with Koreans. Explain their birth rates. So that is an example here of people who are, they have this identity, yet at the same time they're not really having a lot of kids. So what's going on there?
Yeah. Well, I think there's, it's not a one variable equation, right? Japan has a much different tradition and religious structure than Americans or Europeans. And Europe, for the key issue here is it's not explicitly about each individual factor. It's the sum of all of the factors in unison. And so I think it's an oversimplification to just say it's only about national identity that's driving reproduction and people having kids, but I think it's certainly an important component of it.
And any thoughts on the second part of our conversation with Michael when it comes to, how do we address the sheer amount of people that are not up to whatever standard we would, let's say, have for, the future of America? Like, what exactly do we do with that?
Well, I mean, obviously, there's a certain amount of that we're locked into already. I don't. You're not. Some people say, send 300 billion back. I make jokes about that as well, but the reality is that some people are here, and we're going to have to figure out how to actually assimilate them. But I think something that Michael and I probably would both agree on is I think low-hanging fruit is just deporting people who are in clear violation of the law. I don't see anything wrong with that. And I think that's another reason why I wanted to have this discussion.
Yeah,
people like Michael, maybe not some of these more prominent figures like Dana or others, but I think we agree on enough to be on the same path for a fairly long period of time. To deport the number of people that probably need to be deported, and that's what I really want to stop, is just this useless infighting, because we really do, I think, agree on more than it probably seems like.
Yeah, it's like we might agree on, I don't know, is 95% too high? But it's like what's the 5% is where all the action is, right? It's like there's a lot in that 5%.
The bad apples.
Yeah, and so and by the way, on the Japanese question, I've got a friend of mine that told me the other day that he's a weeb or something like that. So I feel like I need to phone a friend. But yeah, Japan's, man, that's a whole nother story. I hope they get that turned around. But yeah, so I think, Crusader, like, I think we probably agree on the vast majority of things. It's just like what, it comes down to, a few key issues. And, I was just going to say, it's like one thing I noticed with a lot of people on the new right, and I'm particularly talking about younger people. I'm not sure your age, but I won't ask, but I am in a different place than a lot of them. I'm 30. Right. And I'm married and I've got 2 kids and whatever. And I don't have a house yet. I'm in an apartment. I do have student loans. I did have teachers for years that force fed me critical race theory and third and fourth wave feminism. I had professors that made other students storm out of the classroom. I remember this happening in 2016. Professor did a 45-minute spiel on Hillary Clinton, and I sat there, I was working on the campaign, and my friend next to me got out and stormed out. And anyway, so I've experienced a lot of the things that I think are contributing to this feeling that there needs to be a new right or whatever. But I have different opinions on solutions. And then I think I also have, in some cases, different sensitivities to certain things that a lot of people on the new right talk about. But again, I would just insist, there is a lot of anti-Semitism also on the new right. I'm not saying it's coming from you, but it is definitely around, and I'm definitely hearing it in my DMs. I'm getting called, Jew, all these things. I told you I'm Catholic, so I don't take it as an insult, but it's
I'm the Jew in the conversation. I think I'm the only one who's Jewish out of 3 of us. I mean, Crusader Pepe, you're Protestant, and Michael, you're Catholic. Yes. So as a fellow member of the tribe over here, at least judging by my mom's side, this has been occurring a lot. But the question that I would ask to the people who are so anti-Jew and anti-Israel, if Israel were to not exist and if Jews were to not exist all of a sudden, would the opportunities there are there for the kind of subversion they imagine Jews are doing, would all of a sudden people who are, let's say, like the Rockefellers, for instance, or who else could I bring up as far as leftist academics who are non-Jewish, a lot of who participated in the Gaza protests, are they all of a sudden going to change their tune and think, well, all this decolonization stuff that we're talking about, all this need to bring in socialism and communism into the West, now that Jews are gone, now that Israel is no more, I'm just going to forget about all that stuff and I'm going to get on board with being a good American and loving this country. I highly doubt it. And a really big problem that I've been seeing is that no matter what happens, Jews are always blamed. But if we forget about Jews for a second and just replace the word Jew with just smart person, maybe with glasses on, if we have people who are smart, you're going to have people who are smart who do good things and do bad things. And the amount of harm that comes from smart people doing bad things can many times be a lot worse than dumb people doing bad things, because smart people doing bad things are better at having those things be done in a much more organized way, in a much more thorough way, you know, things being planned out, yada, yada, yada. And where are most people seeing a lot of Jewish representation? They're seeing it in media articles. And what is the preferred political ideology of most of the media? It happens to be leftist ideology, at least for the most part, you know, other than like, I don't know, New York Post or things like that, right? Like a lot of people in the media lean left. And if you grow up in that environment and you go into the media and you're Jewish, guess what? That's going to be, unfortunately, the default mentality that you're going to have. And a lot of those Jews, by the way, they happen to be very self-hating. They do not like Israel. They don't like the idea of having this, you know, Jewish privilege. Meanwhile, the Jews in Israel, a lot of them couldn't give a shit about any of this self-hatred that those Western Jews feel. And they said they're proud of themselves, they're proud of their identity, they're proud of their accomplishments. And that's the kind of mentality that I wish a lot more American Jews would have. But for the most part, I think like a lot of American Jews are normies. And if you're a normie that's in a media environment, you're going to have your NPR tote bag. You're going to do exactly the same thing that a lot of these Anglo-Saxon normies who also work in the media end up doing. It's not going to be any different. What I do wish, though, as a fellow J man, is for a lot of the Jews that are in the urban environments right now to understand that a lot of the people that are against Jews, especially people who come from, you know, third world environments, who are fired up by Zohar and Madmani, the only thing that they respect at the end of the day is the sword. And this goes back to the difficulty of talking about a lot of these subjects. That history, we feel, is already, you know, behind us. And we feel like, well, the only way we can ever function as people is by always talking things out, and I'm sure the other side will come to some kind of a disagreement. And I find that this is the same thing that a lot of Republicans have towards Russia, where they think that, well, we can, you know, make peace with Vladimir Putin, we could talk it out, I'm sure that we can come to some kind of an agreement. No, the only thing that actually ends up working is when rockets are being sent into Moscow and when the rockets are being sent to destroy the infrastructure to stop the Russian war machine. You know, so in that sense, you know, violence does accomplish things. Just sitting around and pretending people who only respect the sword are going to respect what you have to say because you're such a nice guy, that's never going to work. So as soon as I think most Jews get out of that old, tired mentality, we can actually, by we, I don't mean just Jews, I mean sensible people who love Western civilization, can agree that if we love classic liberalism, we should defend it to our dying breath. That's the only way forward, I think. I don't know.
Yeah, and I think, you know, I mean, I definitely, I see where you're coming from on some of the stuff, Michael. I mean, I think there's a little cope that, like, everything is just this, like, Jewish conspiracy. Like, I do think that's cope. Like, there needs to be some level of accountability. I mean, there was plenty of bad Anglos in society that have really messed up thing, you know, really terrible leftist. And I think, you know, what I like to focus on is I just don't like foreign influence, period. And I do have to get going pretty soon here, but one thing I did want to chat about briefly is just the concept of no enemies on the right, because that's been part of this conversation. And I think one of the misunderstandings that I see from people that I would consider in your camp is they think it just means we never gatekeep, we never address issues internally. And I think that's a misconception. I think the point of no enemies on the right is if you start punching too far to the right, or punching right in general, what's going to happen is you're going to have someone, we'll call them 10 points to the right, they'll get canceled, right? And then someone that's 9 points to the right gets canceled, and then 8 points to the right. And then you work out your way all the way down, and then we're back to Mitt Romney's Hitler. And the concept of no enemies on the right is we're trying to break that cycle. That doesn't mean everyone who's on the right is impervious to criticism or whatever.
Yeah.
But it's about stopping the leftist mechanism of canceling us all the way back in, you know, until we hit Mitt Romney or something, maybe even left of Mitt Romney. And so that's really, I think, does that ring true to you, Michael? Do you understand like that general concept? I'm not saying it's without air.
Yeah. No, it's slippery slope basically, right? Concept. And like you know, I'm always going to criticize left, right, centrist, you know, alien, whoever it is talking positively about Stalin, Hitler, totalitarianism, fascism, communism. I am going to criticize you, right? Like I was a history teacher for 4 years. I taught 20th century Russia, 20th century Germany, 20th century China. Unfortunately, it was all 20th century because what I actually like to read about is like 14th century stuff. But as a teacher, like that's what I taught. My kids are Polish Americans, right? Like all around me. Like I've met survivors from World War II here. I've been to Auschwitz. I got Treblinka over here. Like it's like I'm never going to. I also lived in Germany for a time too, by the way, and I saw like the shame that many people live with in Germany, which is, you know, it's like a deep trauma, like in a way that's hard to even explain. But you know, so I'm always going to call that out. So like that it's not no enemies to the right. It's all enemies who, I don't know what the acronym is, but all enemies who side with Hitler or Stalin. that's you know, so I don't know about no enemies to the right, but yeah.
Is it also possible to adopt a Douglas Murray point of view here, where he did not criticize Joe Rogan that time for, you know, hosting people with opinions he disagrees with? He criticized him as somebody with a big platform for not asking them certain questions and pushing back on some of the things that they were saying. I think he was talking about Daryl Cooper that time, who was also, you know, severely downplaying the Holocaust. So when it comes to that, he was never calling for censorship. He was never calling for gatekeeping. He's not even on the right. You know, he's like a classic liberal guy, but he wasn't calling for gatekeeping. What he was calling for was there should be a modicum of responsibility. And now we seem to have this, on one hand, the goal of having this responsibility, and on the other hand, what is actually going on for the most part is, like I said before, audience capture, where all these people, the Tucker Carlsons and who's the black lady, what's her name? Candace Owens. Owens is like, all these people, they're so dependent on their audiences that if any of them for 1 second decide to change their mind, let's say on Ukraine, for instance, if Tucker were to all of a sudden talk about how wonderful Ukraine is and how we should support Ukraine, you know, half of his audience would just leave. They would go to greener pastures. That's how dependent these people are. So I don't know. I understand Crusader Pepe, what you're talking about, but if we're talking about no enemies to the right, we may be leading ourselves, not just what Michael's talking about, which is absolutely important, like in terms of all this totalitarian thinking, but we're also leading ourselves into complete stupidity because nobody's responsible enough to look at things in an objective way if they're all slaves to their audience. Like, what do we do? What do we do about that?
So I think the difference is that the right is the side of hierarchy and order, and I think it needs to happen internally and quietly. And yeah, obviously there's times for it to be loud, but there's people who I will not name that have essentially been gatekept out of what I would say is the new right in some regards. People just don't associate with them anymore because they've been bad actors or whatever it might be. And I think having this messy public knife fight over some of these issues is exactly why the left wins so effectively, because we're just so obsessed with, well, Candace said this and Tucker said that, and I just don't think we're in a place where we can afford to do that meaningfully. But I think it does have to be more of a top-down directed effort to gatekeep internally, as opposed to these public knife fights that conservatives have been having for really the past 10, 15 years. And so, you know, I agree that, like, there's obviously some line in there for no enemies to the right. Like, yeah. But it's the public shaming and cancellation of, you must oppose this person, otherwise you are evil too. And I think that's the distinction. It's that this social kind of leftist cancellation campaign, that tactic, that's the issue.
Wait, but
So-
what do we do if the people themselves who you're talking about, who claim to be allies of the right, what if they're actually just third worldist assholes who wear the skin suit of being on the right, again, in order to appeal to the audience members? Meanwhile, they're not so different from Glenn Greenwald. You know, they're people who praise Venezuela, who go on interviews. I'm talking about Tucker Carlson, by the way, who go on interviews with the Prime Minister of Qatar, you know, and keep handing this guy softball after softball. Like, if we're talking about these kind of people, who, by the way, I think he also called Trump like a doofus or an idiot or whatever, you know, in this recorded call. If we're talking about people like that, if people just say, well, I'm for traditional values, I'm on the right, it's like, okay, that could be complete bullshit. Why should you trust those people to represent the right? What if this whole Israel thing is part of this whole divide and conquer tactic that people who are the enemies of populism and the enemies of a strong America are doing right now?
Yeah, I mean, it's a hard thing to answer because I'm not really in a position where like someone like J.D. Vance or Trump is. You know, I mean, basically the right needs a more sovereign actor who is more of a clear thought leader that has respect from multiple parties that can essentially exercise justice and discipline. And I don't think the right has that right now, and I think that's what it needs. And so I think the easy answer is you need leadership, and I know that's generic, but you need a sovereign figurehead that can dictate those terms, and that's something we can't just make happen. That person has to appear and take the reins.
Yeah,
I think that makes sense, Michael.
Yeah, I was going to say another person wearing a skin suit, Jackson Hinkle, who on his profile it says Miami, Florida. I get so much crap for it says Warsaw, Poland. It's like half my comments, right? Put out some great tweet or something, I get tons of half the comments. You're in Poland. You're in Poland. You're in Poland. Congrats, you're observant. Here's a pierogi, right? It's like, but Jackson Hinkle, MAGA communist. In my article, I said he puts the moron and oxymoron because it makes no sense. Everything my friend Shabos says he's in Moscow, right? That's what a lot of people are saying. He's based in Moscow. And like, that's a great example of the skin suit thing you were talking about, because how can you possibly be a communist on the right? Right. So it's like there has to be a line somewhere, economically, morally. You know, David Duke was obviously a line, a bridge too far. I think he was a representative for a time. But so there's obviously a line. We just have to figure out where it is. And I think, to be honest, I think Fuentes has crossed it. But the problem is he has such a large following now. It's like, you know, my fear is like, is he like Charles Lindbergh, who was the spokesperson for the America First committee during World War II? Who didn't want to go to war, or is he like, you know, is he like Richard Spencer, or is he like someone more hardline, like right?
Again, all of these things you're talking about, the people at the end of the hall I mentioned are going to be even worse than Fuentes is right now. That's all waiting for us down the road. So the question is, how long are we going to wait to address the same things that Fuentes is talking about, but without basically blaming people who have nothing to do with it?
But I think a lot of the things that I think.
Oh, sorry. I think we're bumping into each other there. Crusader Pepe. Yeah.
And then I got to get going in a couple minutes here. But that's the real problem, is Nick is bringing up very relevant issues that the right just didn't address. And so people like him who actually address them, wrong or right, they're going to get attention because they're willing to touch these civilizational issues that need to be answered. And if what I'll say, you know, more normal people don't address them, then you're going to have this radicalism come up. And so, you know, that's the unfortunate part, and that's why I don't like the establishment trying to not only shut him down, but shut down the conversation around some of these key issues. Is because
the Streisand effect.
Yeah, exactly. And so. But with that, I got to get going here. But
Crusader Pepe, where could people find you?
Yeah, best place is X. So my handle is Crusade, no R, Pepe. If you type in Crusader Pepe, I'll probably come up there. But that's kind of my main outlet.
Excellent. And I would love to have you back maybe for a discussion with Gnostic Informant about Christianity in the United States.
Yeah, that would be great.
All right, let's do it next time. Crusader Pepe, thank you so much. And
Thanks,
Michael, we're going to be finishing up right now, but I just want to remind everybody who's watching this right now, if you guys are enjoying the show, make sure to hit that like button, hit the subscriber button, click the bell, very important for growth. And by the way, all the people who are watching this on X right now, go to breaktherules.tv. That's the YouTube channel that this is on. Watch all the shows. As you could tell from this conversation, what I do is I bring on people who are from very different social circles, yet we manage to find a way that we could actually talk to each other like decent human beings. And I think that we've pretty much accomplished that today. Like, I think that there was a lot of really interesting back and forth, and there are some disagreements, and there are also a lot of things that I found from both of you guys. Like from Michael, I consider myself still a classic liberal, much like yourself, and I think that is a very important thing. Where I would side on Crusader Pepe would be, in order to defend that classic liberalism, how far do you need to go? Not to defend having a Christian hierarchical top-down theocracy, but to defend the classic liberalism the two of us like. If we want that, Poland, I think, is a great example of a country that seems to balance that. And I would love, before we go, just talk a little bit about your experience in Poland and whether I'm right about that.
Yeah, I mean, Poland's a great place to live. I miss the United States every day. A lot of people misunderstand this. I get comments saying like I ran away. For whatever reason I hate America. Totally not true. Like, I'm in the U.S. several months out of the year. I miss the U.S. every day. I watch 50 to 100 baseball games a year here, even with the 6-hour time difference. So still very much American. But Poland is very homogenous Catholic society. Church is always full. Good food, very family friendly, tons of parks, and we live right in downtown Warsaw, and it feels perfectly safe. It's a lot of Poles say I shouldn't talk about it so much because we don't want more people, but I'm just fortunate because my wife and we met in Atlanta, Georgia, in the U.S. Completely randomly, and I'm so happy she's from Poland because I ended up coming to her home country, at least for now. We might come back to the US, we'll see. But I'm so happy she's from Poland and not France or the UK, because right now I would be much less, I'd be watching the door to see if someone's breaking in.
Oui. C'est très tragique. Peut-être après quelque temps, la situation, I forget how you say will be in France. Will be different. The situation will be different in the future. God damn it.
Я не говорю по-русски.
Вы говорите по-русски, это хорошо. Я тоже говорю по-русски. I also speak in a Russian accent, even without speaking the Russian language. But by the way, I want to take also this opportunity to say, if you want to support the show, patreon.com/breaktherules. Become a patron today, and you are going to get a lot of good stuff. You are going to get MP3s of the episodes after they come out. You are going to get to see the live streams that are done, especially from the New York City location, where we bring on people to sit there in an audience. And if you want to be part of the audience in New York City, then if you become a $20 patron, you will get that. You will be able to actually physically come in as an audience member, sit down, we have a fun time, we have the show, then we have an after party on the rooftop if the weather is good, or we're going to go to like a local restaurant or bar. It's a really, really fun time. So I highly recommend you go do that. And by the way, as a Russian, I am somebody who really appreciates Poland and Ukraine, and I really want the government of Russia to be completely annihilated very, very soon. And I'm very, very grateful for the Polish people to be a shield, to be a protection against Russia, but I really don't trust the rest of Europe. I think that a lot of Western Europe is a bunch of wine seepers that are living in a false reality, not seeing the problem with the migration of the Muslims into their country, yes. And they're not going to be adequate when it comes to a Russia that in the future, God forbid, they would take Ukraine and then they would go into the Baltics and Poland. And I don't know that they would be in favor of helping Poland. I really don't. Because a lot of these people, they're hypocrites. They talk about like, oh, we're in supporting of NATO and yada, yada, yada. But when it actually comes down to the wire, I doubt that they're going to act, which is why I think it's kind of good now that Trump has been pushing on Europe to militarily strengthen itself, and Vance has addressed this situation with the migrants. So I really, really hope that that's going to create some change in Europe, and Poland should be a great example for the rest of the Western European nations to start following.
Definitely, yeah. Poland's awesome. I think things are going in a great direction. Like by 2030, we're supposed to surpass the UK economy, which I think says more actually about the UK than Poland. But it's cool, And I think militarily, it's probably still a little behind Germany, but should probably catch up and surpass it, I would think. Yeah.
Oh,
all right, guys. Well, I got to jump. So, hey, great talking to you, and we will see you later.
See you later, Crusader Pepe. And we are going to conclude this. Michael, it was a great pleasure to have you here. Please tell us where people could find more about you.
Sure. On X, I'm at Michael J. Hout, written just how it is on the screen. And on TownHall, I write a column. I've got a piece coming out soon. I interviewed a former leader in the American neo-Nazi movement about rising anti-Semitism.
What was his name?
What was his name? Why? Do you know him?
Well, I don't know. I mean, it depends. There is actually a girl who
Jeff Scope.
No, I don't know him. There is a girl who I actually got high with back at Pico Day, which was, are you familiar with Newgrounds?
Newgrounds?
Newgrounds.com.
No.
Okay, so Newgrounds is this website where young people back in the day, and it's still operating, but like back when I was growing up, like 2003, 2004 was a really popular time when we would submit animations and video games that we make ourselves to this website. And a lot of it has like, parodies of different subjects, like anime parodies, things like that. Yeah, well, that's today, and I'm sure that there's a lot of Roblox and Minecraft parodies there right now. But we were at this event called Pico Day, which was this office party that Newgrounds had in Philly. And one person who I met there, who I got high with in the back lot, was Emily Eucas, who I don't know if you're familiar with Emily. Have you seen the Will Stansel show?
No.
No?
The name's familiar. I haven't, no. I don't think
Okay, so it blew up. I mean, the third episode's not as good as the second one, but it's, Will Stansel, right?
The name's familiar. I can't picture
He's
him.
like this progressive, like lefty guy who always like gets into fights with people on Twitter. And there was this whole controversy that occurred where Grok was writing all of these sexual fantasies about having its way. Grok is like an actual robot cyborg having his way with poor Will Stansel in these really grotesque ways that were described there. And so he was constantly being, the butt of the joke when it comes to this stuff. And Emily Eucas ended up making with AI, and of course a lot of it was like her own artwork and her own editing. Like it wasn't just like she pressed a button to make it, but she made this entire show about Will Stansel, the Will Stansel show. And he has this buddy named Jamal who always says, "It do be like that, Mr. Stansel." And that became like this meme that people kept posting over and over and over again. I'm sure you must have seen it one time.
Yeah.
And in the second episode, he goes to sleep, and then the robots from the AI inside of his phone through Grok, they invade his mind and turn him into like this Alex DeLarge Clockwork Orange guy who Clockwork Orange, right?
Clockwork. I love the book and the film.
Well, then you should definitely watch the second episode. And anyway, and then he like beats up some like Antifa punks and yada yada yada. The whole point.
Which AI?
I think it was. I remember the one with the. Sora. It's Sora. Sora AI. Yeah. So anyway. The only problem with Emily, I think like Emily, she's incredibly brilliant, but she's like a broken toy type of person. Meaning like she grew up in a really bad environment. She got into the alt scene, she was very like a punk rock, but like with a really brilliant kind of imagination in terms of the cartoons that she made. But here's the thing, and I think that this is indicative of a lot of people who end up going into like the deepest of the deep fringes. Somebody like her, who was not really accepted by mainstream society, she saw a lot of the problems that were going on, and unfortunately that made her go all the way to the neo-Nazis. Like to like legit neo-Nazis. I think she even ended up marrying a Nazi guy, if I'm not mistaken. And she says that that is something that actually gave her a lot of structure in terms of how she is, how she acts, and you know, coming from just like completely a messed up, drugged up environment that she was in. And I just imagine how many of the people like back then in like pre-Nazi Germany after World War I, Weimar Republic, how many of them were just like really, really fucked up, broken toys who ended up seeing the swastika and seeing like a new hope for their life.
Well, and it wasn't, you know, now it's like we have a repulsive response, like subconsciously to it. But back then it was just, you know, like the GOP elephant or something. Like they didn't know what that was going to be, right?
Yeah.
And so, in fact, it's an ancient symbol, right? But they might not have known that in Germany at that time. But anyway, yeah, that's really interesting because Jeff, who I spoke to, he got taken out by Daryl Davis, whose nickname is the Clan Whisperer.
Oh, I know Daryl Davis. Yeah.
So Daryl Davis and Jeff were on Joe Rogan together, and that same day that episode dropped, I reached out to Jeff to interview him for the article, and we talked for like 2 hours. And we talked a bit about, like, you know, kind of some of the anti-Semitism stuff on the right. We talked about some of it on the left. We talked about, you know, some other things. And he talked about an assassination attempt he had from Antifa. Wow. So there's going to be a lot of interesting stuff in that piece. And I spoke to a professor as well for it. So I usually have a few columns a week in TownHall, and then, you know, generally at least one in Liberty Affair, and occasionally some other places. So I write quite a bit, but they all go on my X account. So if you just follow me on X. But yeah, as far as with Germany, what you were just saying, so I lived in Germany for a little less than 2 years. And one thing you might find interesting, so I dated a German girl for a time, and I brought her to the United States for a short trip. And we were in Atlanta, went to Atlanta, New Orleans, and we were at a baseball game. Right. And they started to do what was called the tomahawk chop. So they, you know, like the Braves, it's like a Native American thing. So they do this like a tomahawk. Right. And I could just see her eyes get like, like dilate, like, because she's in a stadium with 30,000 people doing the same motion with their arm. And she was like sick to her stomach about it. And I was like, that was one of the times where I realized what I said earlier about like Germans, it's really deep with them, right? It's like history. So they see like 30,000 people in a stadium doing a motion with their arms. That's like, you know, even if it's not Sig Heil, it's like kind of a big deal for them. It registers with them. And you even hear like, you know, football matches for a long time, you wouldn't see German flags necessarily and things like that. And so, yeah, I'm sure, I mean, you know, we could do a whole nother episode on Hitler and the rise of all that kind of stuff. But yeah, I'm sure that was something that, you know, attracted a lot of people. In fact, a lot of the brown shirts were World War I veterans, I think. Yeah. I mean, probably most of them. Yeah.
No, absolutely. And that's why it's going to be very tough, especially going into the future, because a lot of the things that would be considered to be milquetoast conservatism were for a long time said to be, you know, neo-Nazism. And that's where we were, at least back in 2016. I think the Overton window has shifted quite a bit since then, except for the people who are still living like it is 2015, 16.
Open this way.
Yes, exactly. Of whom there are a lot. But a lot, like I said, like a lot of these questions, if we're not going to answer them, they're going to be answered by somebody that's going to make Nick Fuentes look like Larry Fine or whatever his name is. Is it Larry Fine? The congressman.
Randy Fine.
Randy Fine, yeah. So it's going to make Nick Fuentes look like Randy Fine, whatever's coming, if it's not addressed by responsible people in a responsible way. And I'll give you one last thing, just because I would be remiss if I didn't mention it. One thing that could solve the problem that I was asking earlier of how do we address the fact that we're not going to have that many people that are going to think enough ahead, there could maybe be in the future certain requirements to prove oneself as being both somebody with the same ethos and somebody who's responsible enough, where that would enable you to vote. And that's a little bit controversial, and it should never be genetically based, but it should be based on some kind of a criteria that can be proven. And it's a very controversial thing. It's very tough, but that's kind of the only way that I see our society from not succumbing to the masses being rallied around by some charismatic figure that's going to promise them a bunch of free stuff, and then eventually that's going to start tearing society down. Like, there has to be something.
Yeah, I mean, we got to look at incentives. We got to look at culture, right? Like, look at some of the things China's doing. I know Fuentes, in some respects, admires China, but there might be things we can learn from China and do in a non-communist, authoritarian way. Like, look at what they do with their social media, with TikTok and stuff. Don't they like restrict it to educational stuff for minors, and like at a certain point in the night it turns off? Like, we probably don't want that kind of restriction on our freedom, but maybe we should look into like what is the effect of that and things like that. Are there some fine tunings we can do to algorithms, some laws? Because we have 70, 80-year-old congressmen and senators. We're trying to explain to them algorithms that's not
a series of tubes. You remember that guy?
Series of tubes?
Yeah, there was this congressman who called the internet a series of tubes.
Oh no, I didn't.
This is back in the day.
I was going to make the joke that they might think algorithms is the vice president to Bill Clinton's band. The algorithms.
I like that. Yeah. No, I got it. Yeah. No, that's good. No, we do have a lot of dinosaurs, but again, the people who are coming up, I don't see them as being that much better as far as being algorithmically controlled, like I said in the beginning of this conversation. So whatever is going to happen, I believe in a responsible elite, and those are going to have to be the people that are going to figure things out. But what I do like about society in general is that you don't really need that many smart people with a plan to change things. As long as they're responsible, then certain things can be done. Unfortunately, I think at least right now, the people who we do have in the mainstream of the Republican Party, I mean, not even talk about the Democrat Party, but in the Republicans, I think too many of them are just interested in partying. Like once they get certain jobs in DC, they just end up having fun, enjoying themselves, and why shake things up? Why shake things up? Why ruin a good time? Which again goes to the big problem of how we're going to decouple ourselves from Qatar. Because I know people love talking about Israel, but at the end of the day, I mean, you're not going to have any disagreements with me on this subject, obviously. But I do see Israel as being a very required civilizer in that whole Middle Eastern region, which has nothing to do with Jews, nothing to do with Judaism. A lot of the early Zionists, they couldn't give a shit about Yahweh or Judaism or anything like that. They just didn't want their families getting killed, by rabid mobs. So they wanted to participate in Western civilization. They weren't allowed to, so they had Israel. That's at least my explanation.
Yeah, my whole position, and we didn't really get to it with Crusader, but my whole position on Israel is geopolitical. Like, I'm Christian, I'm Catholic, I'm a Zionist, I guess, but by standard definition. But I don't really call myself a Christian Zionist because I'm not looking at it through a spiritual lens at all. I'm looking at it through a geopolitical lens. Like Naftali Bennett was prime minister for 13 months in 2021, I think 2022, and he said in that 13 months, there were 30 times that he called Western countries to tell them about a specific terror threat that they found out about. And he said, go to this building, go to this floor, go to this apartment. Here's the guy who's in there 30 times in 13 months. And so we could pay for that as a service. Like, okay, here's $50 million. Thanks for the tip. Or we could just fund them as we are and have them as a military base, as a essentially a bulwark against radical Islam and an expanding Islamic caliphate. Like, I think they're absolutely essential. And so this whole argument that they're somehow taking so much from us with no value, like, I think the ROI is actually pretty good.
Well, people were making the argument that you were saying about Israel taking stuff from us the source, if we were to believe him, because if he's a spook, I don't believe everything spooks say. Spooks are natural liars. But there was this guy, Ari Ben Menash, who wrote this whole book about the way that Mossad works. And what he was talking about back in the day is that the United States got Israel to extract a king's ransom from Iran. This was after the revolution, 1979, to extract a king's ransom from Iran, a lot of money from them, in exchange for United States weapons to be sold to Iran so that they can fight against Iraq during the Iraq-Iran war. But the other interesting part here is that America was also funding Iraq at the same time. So were the French, by the way, who were the ones who gave Saddam Hussein nukes. So this idea that like Israel is making America like a puppet master, do all these things. No, in this case, it was the United States that was making Israel do these particular trades with Iran in order to weaken both Iran and Iraq in the process. So a lot of it does actually go back to the CIA and the spooks over there. Even with the nuclear stuff, you had examples of, again, according to this guy's book, of Robert Maxwell, who, as you know, was the father of Ghislaine Maxwell and the alleged like the guy who taught the ropes to Epstein. And he was someone who was both working for Mossad, MI6, and the Soviet Union. And what he was doing was he was allegedly implanting Israeli backdoors into the various governments of the world by selling them the software called Promise, PROMIS. But the interesting thing was that when he sold it to this one nuclear site in the United States, the people of that nuclear site called up the CIA and was like, guys, what the fuck is going on? What do we do? And they said, everything's all right. Don't worry about it. Forget it. Meaning the spooks in the United States knew this was going on. They had no problem with it. And these would have been like people in the highest areas. So again, when it comes to this intelligence sharing that's been going on between the United States and Israel, it wasn't like Israel was doing some surreptitious things. Everything that was going on with the full acknowledgement of the United States government for the most part.
Yeah, and I've never said like there can't be a discussion about it, like and you know, a lot of our conversation, which was great, like it was not about Israel, which is fine, but like it has seemed like a lot of the conversation online has been dominated by Israel, right? And like for my part, like, you know, people can be in the conservative tent in the right wing without being, you know, Zionists or without like, but just have some good reasons and realize that like there are benefits to that relationship. And, you know, it is a long-term alliance built out of, you know, one of the worst tragedies in human history, right? The Holocaust. And
yeah, but that's never going to work. We're at an environment right now, unfortunately, where any appeal to anything having to do with the Holocaust or morality or like people look at that as, oh, this is just like some Jewish trick. You know what I mean?
People look at the geopolitics at least, and will they say like, okay, in the example of Bennett, I don't know for under Netanyahu, but under Bennett, 30 times in 13 months warning the West of a terror attack, right? I mean, and that's a flaw with our brains, our psychology, which is, you know, like obviously like 9/11 sticks in our heads, like these different Christmas bombings, all these things, which
by the way, they also blame, you know, who for?
The Jews, right?
Yes,
yeah,
exactly.
For everything that ever happened. JFK's assassination, I deal with this all the time because I engage. But like, you know, like there's obvious value to that information, and there's obvious value to having that ally there. And by the way, full disclosure, I've been to Israel 3 times. I've never been paid $7,000. If they want to start paying me, you know, I'm not going to change any of my positions, but they can pay me if they want. But like, I'm just kidding. But like, you know, it's obviously a beneficial ally to have there with the threat of Islam. And, you know, I think, you know, Laura Loomer kind of makes that point and stuff too. But I think a lot of people
also on the show, by the way, she was also on the show.
On the show?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, cool. Yeah. But like, the problem is, I think a lot of people make the argument from the wrong place, like where, like you're saying, like I just did that, like talking about the Holocaust, like to me as someone who's like reading, you know, 14th century history books, and it's like, I obviously love history, and it's like the history stuff works on me, like it's not going to work on everyone. And so, like I guess geopolitics is the argument, right? Like strategic
It's
value.
sort of, I sort of agree with you, but maybe another important part of this is not so much geopolitics as it is what exactly is the ethos of the West? What exactly is the thing that we're trying to defend here? And at that point, we should equally go against not just like the Madmanis and the leftists, but also these rich oil Arab countries like Qatar, for instance, which people have been doing for the most part, like I mentioned before, Douglas Murray. But again, the reason why I think people who are more on the right don't listen to people like Douglas is that they see him as being like this reasonable English gentleman who, is too aligned with Israel and loves Israel too much. There is going to have to be a focus on, as things start, getting worse, unfortunately, there will maybe be a focus more on what is it that both Jews and non-Jews who are in interest of keeping Western civilization thriving, what is it that we are prepared to do as a people in order to ensure that? And there has to be more of the strong horse energy, if that makes kind of sense. We're not going to withstand whatever's coming in this age with just this attitude of, we could just talk it out, we could agree to disagree. No, we're unfortunately going to get into the stage right now of like the strong men in hard times. And within that environment, a lot of Jews are going to start having to be maybe not religiously like him, but a little bit more like, I don't know if you ever heard of Meir Kahane.
Kahane?
Yeah, Meir Kahane. He was the founder of the JDL, the Jewish Defense League.
Okay.
And it's considered to be like a terrorist organization.
Oh, I see.
It's like a pro-Jewish terrorist organization who ended up cleaning up Brighton Beach, where when I first came to New York City, that's where my family and I were living around. And in the 70s or 80s, like when the neighborhood was like really, really bad, there was a lot of like thuggery and, killings and things like that. He cleaned up Brighton Beach using force. And at the end of the day, I think that's what most people, especially a lot of these online people, respect. As much as they, talk about, how horrible Israel is, the bombings and all that, at the end of the day, everybody respects force.
Did he wear a beret?
He didn't wear a beret. I don't think they were like militarily clad. I think they were still like in civilian uniforms. But he's an interesting guy. He wore a yarmulke. Yarmulke. Yeah, he was like a more traditional, and he ended up getting assassinated, I think by a Palestinian guy. But anyway, that's just like an example of we don't have to agree with everything that somebody like that said. But as far as the kind of projection of force, like if we're serious about wanting to preserve the West and wanting especially to preserve liberalism, it's going to take a lot of strong energy if we don't want that energy to be eventually shown by somebody who's going to be completely antithetical to our worldview. If we like our worldview, then we have to defend our worldview, and we have to defend our worldview to the death.
So what's your prognosis? Like, are you a adherent of, I don't know if adherence is the right word, but are you like familiar with like the fourth turning and all that stuff? Like what's your prognosis for the next 20 years?
Oh God, that's the problem. No, the problem is that a lot of the things that by the way, look at this comment over here. There is an irony in preserving liberalism by force, but that's the whole point. Because if you're not going to preserve the kind of things that the founding fathers wanted this world to be like, then what's the point? What are you preserving then? Are you just going to preserve us going into grug mode and like slinging shit at each other like a bunch of monkeys? That's what you want to preserve? No. You would rather preserve people who are responsible enough to have a sense of their own liberty without having some top-down dictator order everybody, how to stand up in the morning and when to bend down. That's no way to live. That's not a life worthy of a human being. And I think that's what a lot of these far-right Groyper types online kind of ignore, because they're so rightfully so dissatisfied with the way that things are going in their culture that they think, okay, well, we got to go back to tradition. But a lot of tradition has not really been that good, just in terms of being something worthy of a human being. A lot of it, for the most part, has been people that were living in this kind of, in this very subservient way. And the people that were able to escape that kind of matrix, if we're talking about like the ancient Greeks, if we're talking about, like the Iranian, top caste of people there, they were people who ended up longing for something a lot more sophisticated in life. And yeah, eventually that started to decay, as all of these things do. But that's just like when you stop brushing your teeth. Your teeth start to decay when you stop maintaining it. So my only point here is that if we want to maintain liberalism, if we want to stop from degenerating into just being people that can only be ordered around by some warlord in order to get us to behave, like if we want actually ourselves to behave without being forced to behave, or else our hands get cut off like they did in the Middle East for a long time, then we got to work on that, and we got to defend that, and we got to defend that, in ways that are actually very, very close to that level of barbarism, with a certain...
Frozen?
Sorry about that. I am back with a certain amount, defend liberalism with a certain amount of barbarism that's not going to breach the point of no return. And that's the toughest thing of all, right? How do you defend liberalism knowing that, you're going to have to do incredibly horrible things probably, but at the same time, if your goal is to defend liberalism from degenerating into the same kind of like animal-like conditions that we've escaped from, how do you manage that? It's super tough. It's the toughest thing of all. It's much easier to say that, well, we're just going to apply this top-down traditional system and everybody's going to follow it. That's easy. All we have to do is wait until things get really, really bad. It's the easiest thing in the world.
What percent, in your opinion, of the dissatisfaction that the new right has is personal dissatisfaction with their life, ability to buy a house, student loans, things are expensive, all these things, they can't find a girlfriend, whatever. And what percentage do you think is civilizational anxiety, I suppose?
I don't know. I mean, mostly I think it's probably both. People think about a lot of things in the shower. I don't know.
Yeah.
People think about civilizational. Yeah.
I'm wondering, because again, I come at this from a different perspective, married to kids and stuff. And a lot of these Groypers I talk to, it's, tend to be kind of single, whatever, and concerned about, being able to afford things and other stuff like this. I don't really know the extent to which it's like working class or not, but in my small sample size, it has been. And so I guess I'm just wondering on some level, if they have a wife, they have kids, are the concerns the same? But then again,
probably not. No, not at all. If you have a family, then you're not going to think about this stuff. You have a family to deal with. Your brain's not going to be able to handle both things at once.
So on some level, is it a fight on the right between people with families and people without? And a very simplified,
Sure, but that doesn't mean that one side is right and one side is wrong. Because if you're a dad, you got all this dad stuff you got to deal with now. Most people aren't like you. Most people are not going to consider all of these things. I mean, you can't do this for the living. It's a different situation with you. But for most people, once they get out of that environment and they have all this family responsibility now, we shouldn't expect them to be able to wear two hats at once. It's very, very tough. But this is again why the people who are able to focus on this, unfortunately, a lot of them have this audience capture effect, even if they mean well. If they, especially if you're in the right, because the right, at least in the fringes, it's still a small, at least at first, group of people. If you're not a huge creator, if you're a small creator who's on the right, if all of a sudden you start adopting a point of view about something that's, again, I always bring up Ukraine, if all of a sudden you start supporting Ukraine, you're going to lose half your audience, because they've been conditioned to think that supporting Ukraine is bad because the Democrats supported Ukraine and because Russia's base and yada, yada, yada. And because, we don't want to waste American money fighting another war just like Iraq. So they still have Iraq in the back of their mind. So that's why it's very tough. Like, how would you as a content creator, if you want to make money, if you want to have an audience, how would you be able to acquire this right-wing audience if you actually are going to be objective?
Yeah, I've just my account's grown a lot in the last couple of weeks because I've been getting fortunate and shared by a lot of bigger creators some of the things I've been writing, and I just try to be. It sounds corny, but I just try to say what I believe, and that's it. Like, I don't worry about the audience capture thing. But then again, I'm not only working for TownHall. I'm a communication strategist. I've been working in consulting for 8 years, and U.S. companies, right? And while I'm here, and which is like a superpower, right? Because it's zloty here, currency, and so like I think for people that do worry about that, which I don't know why Candace Owens is worried about audience capture. Isn't she married to like a billionaire? It's like there's something psychological beyond just the money, right? About audience capture. And I'll tell you this, I'm more concerned about audience capture with organizations like TPUSA, like not just creators, but organizations, because I look at Brett Cooper's statements recently, like, she's coming out saying these statements about Israel, telling Randy Fine to go to Israel, all these things. And I've been hearing more and more from people, I won't say who, but like sources I trust, that there's some issues with TPUSA with audience capture with, maybe I shouldn't say with audience capture because I don't know fully what decisions they're going to make, but there's issues in terms of more and more of their chapter leaders and people like this are of that new right mindset. Mm-hmm. And you're starting to see news stories about it, like University of Florida the other day and other ones. So I'm worried about audience capture beyond just social media, like actual organizational level, like is TPUSA, or not to pick on them specifically, but our college Republicans, there's 2 college Republicans groups now for some reason, like, which is strange to me, right? And one of them seems to be led by someone who tweets out a lot of things that are associated with kind of Groyperism, right? So that seems to be a split. So this is a big problem. It's causing a big rift on the right, and I think I'm a little more reasonable to like want to engage. I think a lot of people
Absolutely.
are not.
Who are the people, if you don't mind me asking, who are the big people you would say that have shared your pieces online that helped amplify what you're talking about?
Dana Loesch. I mean, she obviously had me on about it. Mm-hmm. Seth Dillon, and he messaged me and he thanked me and for like naming names or whatever. And they both followed me, which is super cool. James Lindsay, a bunch of different people like that. But I've been really fortunate with that stuff in the past because I've always had a good work ethic about like when I write something, send it to a bunch of people because you never know. Yeah. And like I've gotten responses on email from like Tucker Carlson before and stuff like that. But I don't have his email anymore because that was at Fox. But so I've had, I would say like a lot of the work in the piece is like kind of the marketing of it and building up those connections so that when you have the piece come out, you know what I'm saying?
No, it's all very important. But the people you're talking about right now, like with Dana and James Lindsay and so on and so forth.
Side. Yeah.
Well, they're people who are not indicative of the Dionysian wave that the people on the right are going on. And again, so much of this is, again, this whole strong horse, weak horse thing. As much as we may agree with Randy Fine, he is not somebody who is at, unfortunately to say, a good presentable level of a fat percentage to be on the stage. And, I mean, we got to be honest here, right? Like that stuff, it doesn't matter.
Fat or fact?
Fat.
Oh.
Fat percentage, not fact percentage, fat percentage. Like it's unfortunate, but it's like it is what it is. People respect people who are strong. People respect people who don't mince words, who understand what's at stake. And if people have been led in order to think that, every problem is originated from Israel, then, like I said before, these problems have to be addressed in a way maybe that goes like 10 times more extreme than the Groypers do, as long as we can agree on what our reality should be like. And then the strong horse will develop. Otherwise, people are going to go for the strong horse when they notice what the strong horse is, which again, for a long time has been stimulated by what are these forbidden things we're not allowed to talk about? Well, I am going to talk about it. And thus, if I construct the N towers and if I, call out the J's for, all of their hand rubbing, then people will see me as being a hero, as somebody who is not unlike a young Andrew Jackson who refused to polish the boots of the British officers during the revolutionary times. You see what I'm saying, right? Because that effect is speaking truth to power and risking your own reputation by doing so. And it's like, punching the strong guy in prison. All these things are examples of something that shows yourself being a hero, being a strong horse to all the people that are seeing these problems. So again, the only way forward is to strong horse it, or else it's not going to work, and it's going to have to be a hell of a strong horse.
My concern is like, I think it was Mark Mitchell commented on something I wrote yesterday, and he said basically that they're doing it to make me mad, like to talk about Hitler and Stalin and all these things. And like on the one hand, like I am probably a bit of a boomer in a millennial skin suit, right? A little bit, like I am kind of older than my age in some way, but absolutely true. So I might not be totally wrapping around my mind around all this internet culture, but I do spend a lot of time researching it, talking to people, all these things. And absolutely, some of the conversations I have with people, they absolutely are Holocaust deniers. They absolutely are fans of Hitler. They absolutely are fans of Stalin. But I think a lot of people don't understand, like, Nick could be joking. I don't think he is. Nick could be joking. Some of these other people could be joking, but people could take it literally. And some seem to be taking it literally. And again, I don't think Nick is joking. And so,
but also it's in vogue. Like Honkler Bear over here, who, by the way, Bear, I guess that means he's a fan of that comedian. What's his name? I'm trying to remember his. You know who I'm talking about? There's this guy who calls his audience bears. He's a comedian who became like super.
Bert Kreischer?
No, not Bert Kreischer.
Oh.
No, I'll remember his name. Anyway, the point is that like what the Honkler guy posts over here, this is in vogue right now. Like they're thinking like he, this is so controversial. Like no, like this is actually.
Is he saying it as the clown, or is he saying it as the frog? Is he saying it like in jest or in seriousness?
Well, no. This is complete seriousness. But he's saying it in a way as to imply I am doing something forbidden right now. I am eating the forbidden fruit. Look how naughty I am. And all of these people are so uptight. They're never going to allow us to speak about this stuff. I don't think so. I think this is actually something that people on the left and the far right do agree upon, about talking about this stuff today in such a way, like it almost feels like this is my conspiracy theory, that there has been this building up of talking about the Jews as this forbidden fruit, so that once the gates are open and you can talk about it, that's what people are only going to focus their energy on. They're going to forget about anything else, and they're going to focus on the Jews. And at the end of the day, it's like, okay, you're doing it. You see people doing it online right now. There's nothing controversial about that. People are actually normalized to this kind of questioning. And okay, congratulations, you talk about it, and then let's say you end up solving this question of yours. Well, are a lot of these societal problems that you're blaming the Jews for, are they going to go away? How exactly are they going to go away? Because I think that's what a lot of these people think, that once you do what Hitler wanted to do, once you get rid of these, problematic people, then all of a sudden society is going to function in an orderly way. The only way that it is going to function in any orderly way is for people to become close to like literal cyborgs. Like this is the idea that Jason Giorgiani had, which I find to be pretty interesting, where he has this idea of these Nordics, and it's like a long thing to get into, and it's completely would derail our conversation right now if I were to like get into like who the Nordics are. But let's put it like kind of,
Okay.
but not really.
Okay.
It's more complicated. But anyway, the idea of the Nordic archetype is that these are people who are very cold, calculating, and they don't have a sense of humor other than Schadenfreude. Like they get off on the misery they inflict on other people. You know, like they're very lizard brain in a way, but they're very well organized and they're really intelligent, like super intelligent. And these are examples of people who are in this absolutely dominating hive mind where everybody acts in unison. And Giorgiani's problem with that kind of society is, well, that society does not result in any kind of creativity. And the kind of creativity that does spark inside of humans, I think, is the one that does come from this balance between the Dionysian and the Apollonian, from this balance between liberty and responsibility. While these people, they have already just like created this kind of complete organized, this complete organized hive mind. So I think that there is a part of us today who are on the internet who long for that kind of sense of control just because we see the chaos going on everywhere. And we imagine that if we get rid of all these problematic elements, forget about the fact that we have all these WASP and Catholic organizations, Catholic too, sorry to say, which are supporting, mass migration efforts, into various parts of the world.
The Pope?
Yeah, there we go. But if they imagine these problematic elements are dealt with sufficiently enough, then humanity can become, this kind of Übermensch. But becoming an Übermensch, at least in Giorgiani's view and kind of in my view as well, is not being in this hive mind state of complete organization. Because then you are still beholden to some kind of a organizing principle that lessens the amount of creativity that you can create in the world. I know it gets into the weed, it's a little bit complicated, but that will be my answer even if I were to Silverman their idea, because that would be the complete Silvermanning of the Nazi ideology. That's like complete organization, complete focus, creating all these big structures, the trains run on time, everything works. But there is going to be this tendency for people to just solidify into these almost like cyborg people, which again, maybe in comparison to what people are seeing today, people look at that as being, the solution to everything. But I would encourage people to think twice about it.
You're making me think of like Goethe in Italy, like responsibility and leisure. So like the German representation of like responsibility and like organization, and then Italy, the chaos and leisure. So I don't know if you're familiar with Goethe, like his travels.
Of course, yeah, I'm familiar with Goethe.
But he had like these famous travels to Italy, and it was like looking at the ruins of the Roman Empire and things like this when he was like a government servant or whatever. But so when you're talking about like leisure and responsibility, and you made a couple of German references, that like my mind went to Goethe in Italy. I was just remarking that.
No, I could definitely see people like Goethe being those that end up being looked up to, as opposed to the people that they're currently looking up to now. But again, what do you want from people, man? Like, what do you want from people who are raised with the internet?
It's
this
hard.
is
Yeah, because I taught and I was a teacher several years prior to, at least ChatGPT might have existed, but I was a teacher prior to it being ubiquitous, and then I was a teacher after it was ubiquitous. And man, it's tough. It's like it's really tough. I mean, we had to like go back in time to like paper essays like in person. Like, I can't even send them home with their laptops, or I would. And it's like, but I know it's going to be, it's a really hard problem. I don't know. I mean, I really don't know how you solve it. I think
you don't solve it. You were asking me before, what's going to happen in 20 years?
Early.
Well, maybe we're going to have like a genetic bottleneck where we're going to have people who are going to be more of like the Untermenschen, people who are completely absorbed into the online culture. They're wearing like the VR headsets. And then we're going to have the Übermenschen, who are going to be the ones that end up finding this nice balance between responsibility and liberty. And they would be the people that should be the ones that are responsible enough to have certain like next level technologies. You know what I mean? Like having the ability to raise your IQ, having the ability to genetically edit your body so that you're like stronger, faster, yada, yada, yada. Like, I don't really know if that's something that we should give out to everybody, because like Giorgiani said in that episode I recently had with him, if you have people who are complete morons, but they're high IQ all of a sudden because of genetic alteration, that doesn't mean that they're smart. It just means that they're able to calculate things in a slightly like more efficient way, and they can have their, retardation spread all over the world now. You know what I mean? But in a much more organized fashion. So that's not going to be good either. So
ubiquitous retardation.
Retardation. And with that, I think that's a good note for us to end on. I want to thank Honkler Bear for being one of the most prolific commenters today. So again, it's like over here, internet to look into the Holocaust. Okay, great. It's like at the end of the day, let's say you find out. Yes. Well, let's say you find out like some secret information out that was hidden, that like reduces the amount of lives lost. Let's say you get that. Okay, congratulations. What do you do after that? It's like, where exactly do they stop with this? And the other thing over here, one last comment I just wanted to read. Here. So, bros, we don't want to fuck with Jews. Just leave us in peace. And again, this implies that there is a unleaving in peace modality of constantly doing things to subvert, which again, what about the Catholics? What about the WASPs that are bringing the migrants in? What exactly are we talking about here as far as like who is doing what in terms of cultural subversion? So again, this whole argument is built on this NPC catnip that unfortunately we're going to have to go through. But if I am right about this genetic split that's going to start occurring later on, the problems we're talking about right now with these young people, don't worry about it. Like, Michael, you're going to be fine. Your family's going to be fine because you're a responsible individual, and so are they, thanks to you and your wife. But for the people that are raised in the internet right now, like, we're constantly like, oh my God, what are we going to do with these radicalized people? We don't do anything. We put the chips in them. It's so easy. We bring them into their own, like, snake eating its own tail, self-referencing ecosystem. Yeah, exactly. The Ouroboros. And that's it. That's the, like, forget everything we even talked about. That's the solution. That's the solution. Because if they're incapable of functioning like a responsible human being, that seems to be the best way forward. And that's what I think.
Be careful not to get into eugenics or something.
Well, it's not eugenics. It's giving people so much of a good time, thanks to the algorithm, that they're not going to want to have kids. They're just going to want to spend more time online, which is already happening, by the way. It's already happening. It's already upon us. Now, the smart people just have to think about a way to organize in order to preserve what we have and do something about the whole voting thing, in order for the people who are smart enough and who are responsible enough to be able to steer the systems of government away from like the mob rule, and then we'll be Gucci. That's my plan. I don't know. Is it too controversial? Is it too evil?
I just get a little, I have a little trepidation whenever I hear something like along the lines of, something about the votes, like mob control. I'm just one person, one vote guy. Like I get where you're coming from. Like, I'm also sympathetic to like constitutional monarchism coming back in France and Russia and other places. But
Russia, I would argue that's a horrible thing, but that's a different anyway.
But I don't know. I mean, it did get worse after. Yes.
Well, I mean, Russia's just like this top-down shithole where no amount of constitution would ever change that until they get rid of the KGB people that are in charge. But that's a whole other story. But no, I sympathize with what you're talking about with the voting, and ideally that would be the case. But again, if people are going to be so algorithmically manipulated, then we don't really have like what choice. Like I always kept saying, this program, what choice is there? What choice do we have? Like we can either pretend this is not going on, or if we acknowledge that it is going on, then at least if it's us, by us I mean like responsible, liberal-minded people who are the ones that are going to figure out the best way out of this, versus the actual like bloodthirsty tyrannical dictators. And 100%, all of us has the capacity, like Hannah Arden talked about, have the capacity to become monsters. And that's like putting on the One Ring. And unfortunately, that's just something we're going to have to go through history. And, let's have fun with it. This is all the dance of the child anyway, right? Like that's, I don't remember the specific term within, Hindu philosophy or Buddhism, but there is this idea that all of the universe is this cosmic dance, is this cosmic play. It's like a child's play that we're all engaged in right now, where we all play our specific roles as these individual people. And some of us start getting more aware that this is actually a play that's going on. I mean, this goes more into like the spiritual stuff, but if you learn to have fun with it, especially if you have kids and play with your kids, then it makes life, I think, a lot more interesting.
Yes, it does. It does.
And with that, I want to thank Michael for being here. I hope this has been a fruitful conversation for you. It definitely has been for me, and I hope it's been for Crusader Pepe as well. When you're going to be back in New York City, if you ever were in New York City before, were you in New York City before?
Oh, all the time, because I went to school in Amherst, so I was in New York a lot. 2 hours. Yeah,
so next time you're in New York City, unless it's already, like in the complete Civil War scenario, let's, with whatever's going to happen with Trump and Mimani, let's see.
I'll give him a few months to see.
Sure. Yeah. So I would love to get together. So let me know when you're going to be here, all right?
Sounds good.
All right.
Very nice to meet you. Thanks
you
for
too. Guys, thank you so much for watching. Be sure to smash that like button, smash that subscribe button, click the bell. Be sure to tune in for more next week. Patreon.com/breaktherules. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye. Oh, did I stop? Oh, I had to press the end stream button. All right, now bye-bye for real. Here we go.